Some stops were never meant to be made. Sherman Summit rises 8,247 feet above sea level, the highest point the Union Pacific Railroad ever crossed in its original transcontinental route. Located in Albany County, Wyoming, approximately 30 miles northwest of Cheyenne, the summit represented both an engineering triumph and a persistent operational challenge. The grade approaching from the east climbed relentlessly, forcing locomotives to labor against gravity and thin mountain air. In winter, temperatures dropped well below zero, and snowdrifts could bury the tracks in hours. The railroad maintained a small station house at the summit throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, primarily for emergencies and crew changes. The landscape surrounding Sherman Summit is vast and exposed. To the north, the Laramie Range stretches toward the horizon in undulating waves of granite and sparse timber. To the south, the terrain falls away into high plains scattered with sagebrush and the occasional weathered outcropping. The wind at the summit is constant, a low, persistent presence that early railroad workers described as the voice of nothing talking to itself. Before the railroad arrived, the Arapaho people called this high country the place where the sky touches down, though they rarely lingered there. Some historians have noted that tribal routes deliberately avoided Sherman's summit, preferring lower passes even when they added days to a journey. By 1903, the summit had already accumulated a modest reputation for mechanical failures, unexplained delays, and crew unease. Engineers reported instruments behaving erratically at altitude. Brakemen complained of vertigo that persisted long after descending. The Union Pacific kept meticulous records of every irregularity, and those records show that between 1889 and 1902, Sherman Summit logged more unspecified operational delays than any other point on the Wyoming Division, despite having no significant infrastructure, no major junctions, and no scheduled stops. On the night of March 14, 1903, Union Pacific Train number 417 departed Laramie at 9:42 in the evening, bound for Cheyenne. The consist included one locomotive, 3 freight cars carrying mining equipment, and 2 passenger cars with a combined total of 46 ticketed passengers. The engineer was a man named Harold Whitmore, 41 years old, with 16 years of service on the Wyoming Division. His fireman was a younger man, Samuel Okonkwo, recently transferred from the Nebraska lines. Both men had clean records and no history of disciplinary issues. At approximately 11:19, as train number 417 crested Sherman Summit, Whitmore applied the emergency brake. The train came to a full stop within 800 feet. Whitmore later testified, in a written statement filed with the Union Pacific Operations Office in Omaha, that he had observed a second train, fully illuminated, approaching eastbound on the same track at a distance of approximately 1/4 mile. He described the approaching train as having 3 headlamps burning, which is not standard, and noted that it appeared to be moving at considerable speed. Whitmore sounded the whistle twice, the standard warning signal for an imminent collision. He then sent Okonkwo forward with a lantern to flag the approaching train. Okonkwo walked nearly 1/4 mile into the darkness. He found nothing, no train, no lights, no sound of an approaching locomotive. The track ahead was empty, the rails cold and undisturbed beneath a thin layer of frost. The delay lasted exactly 17 minutes. During that time, 3 passengers from the rear coach stepped off the train. Their names, as recorded on the manifest, were Eleanor Vance, a 34-year-old seamstress from Rock Springs, Frederick Holmgren, a 52-year-old mining surveyor traveling to Denver, and a child listed only as Monsieur Delacroix, age 9, unaccompanied minor. When the train resumed its journey at 11:36, none of the 3 reboarded. Conductor James Calloway conducted a head count as the train departed and immediately noted the discrepancy. He walked the length of both passenger cars twice checking each seat. The 3 passengers were simply gone. Their belongings, a carpet bag, a leather satchel, and a small trunk, remained in the overhead compartments. Calloway noted in his log that the windows in the rear car were closed and latched, and that no one had reported seeing the passengers exit. The train arrived in Cheyenne at 12:51 in the morning. The luggage of all 3 missing passengers was offloaded and held at the station. Eleanor Vance's carpet bag contained sewing supplies, a Bible, and 3 letters addressed to a sister in California. Frederick Holmgren's satchel held surveying instruments and a journal with entries dated through March 13th. The child's trunk contained clothing, a wooden toy horse, and a photograph of a woman who was never identified. None of the 3 passengers was ever seen again. The Union Pacific launched an internal investigation within 48 hours. A search party was dispatched to Sherman Summit on March 16th, led by Division Superintendent Marcus Webb. Webb's team walked the tracks for 2 miles in each direction, examined the station house, and interviewed the sole occupant, a telegraph operator named Ingrid Lindqvist, who had been on duty the night of the incident. Lindqvist's account, preserved in the investigation file, is notable for its brevity. She stated that she heard the train's whistle at approximately 11:19 and observed it stopped on the tracks for some time. She did not see any passengers disembark. She did not see a second train. When asked if anything unusual had occurred that night, Lindqvist paused for nearly 30 seconds before answering. The wind stopped. Webb pressed her to elaborate. Lindqvist explained that in her 11 months stationed at Sherman Summit, the wind had never stopped. Not once, not for any duration. But on the night of March 14th, during the 17 minutes the train was stopped, there was absolute silence. No wind, she said, no sound at all, like the summit was holding its breath. Other witnesses offered fragments that refused to coalesce into a coherent picture. A passenger named Robert Achebe, a minister traveling to Cheyenne for a church conference, reported seeing a pale light moving alongside the train during the stop, though he admitted he might have been half asleep. A woman named Catherine Sorensen, seated in the forward coach, said she heard what sounded like footsteps on the roof of the train, though she dismissed it as probably the brakeman. Samuel Okonkwo, the fireman, gave a formal statement that he had walked the track and found nothing, but colleagues later reported that he refused to discuss the incident and requested a transfer to the California lines within 2 weeks. Harold Whitmore, the engineer, stood by his account until his death in 1931. In his written statement, he described the approaching train in precise detail: 3 headlamps, a dark locomotive, passenger cars with lit windows. He estimated its speed at 35 to 40 miles per hour. He was certain it had been real. "I have seen mirages in the desert," Whitmore wrote. "This was not a mirage. This was a train." The Union Pacific investigation concluded on April 2, 1903. The official finding attributed the delay to engineer error resulting from visual distortion caused by atmospheric conditions. The disappearance of the 3 passengers was categorized as voluntary departure and referred to local law enforcement. The Albany County Sheriff's Office opened a missing persons file that was closed without resolution in 1905. Railroad historians have noted several anomalies in the documentary record. The dispatch logs from Laramie for March 14, 1903, show that no eastbound trains were scheduled on the Sherman Summit route until the following morning. Yet a handwritten notation in the margin of the log, initialed but not signed, reads, "EB consist past SS at 23:17. The notation does not appear in the typed summary prepared for the investigation. No explanation has ever been offered for its presence or meaning. The Summit Station was decommissioned in 1901, 2 years before the incident. Yet Ingrid Lindqvist was stationed there on the night in question, employed by a work order that has never been located in Union Pacific archives. Her name does not appear on any payroll records after March of 1903. Sherman Summit was bypassed entirely when the railroad realigned its route in 1953, following decades of operational difficulties. The original track bed remains visible from the air, a faint scar across the high country leading to a place the trains no longer go. The luggage of Eleanor Vance, Frederick Holmgren, and the child known only as M. Delacroix was held at the Cheyenne station for 7 years before being transferred to a railroad storage facility in Omaha. In 1942, the facility was cleared to make room for wartime materials. No record exists of what happened to the unclaimed belongings. The wooden toy horse was photographed during the initial inventory. The photograph shows a hand-carved figure, simply made, with no distinguishing marks except for a small symbol etched into its base. Researchers who have examined the image describe the symbol as resembling a circle bisected by a vertical line, though the photograph is too degraded to confirm this. The same symbol appears on a survey marker at Sherman Summit, placed there in 1867 by a mapping expedition that lost 2 members to unexplained circumstances. No one has explained the connection, no one has explained the 17 minutes, and no one has explained why, on certain nights in early spring, Union Pacific engineers crossing the Laramie Range still report seeing lights on the abandoned summit grade, 3 of them burning in the darkness, approaching from the west on tracks that no longer exist. Some stops were never meant to be made. Some passengers were never meant to arrive. The files remain, the questions remain, and Sherman Summit remains, silent, windswept, and waiting for the next train that will never come. Some passengers are never meant to be counted. Wind River Canyon cuts through the Owl Creek Mountains in Fremont County, Wyoming, a narrow passage where the Bighorn River has carved through 2 billion years of geological history. The canyon walls rise more than 2,000 feet in places, layered in bands of red, gray, and ochre stone that geologists have used to trace the formation of the continent itself. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway completed its line through the canyon in 1913, but before that, an earlier spur line operated by the Wyoming and Northwestern Railroad ran a more precarious route along the canyon's eastern rim, a track so narrow and exposed that engineers called it the Ledge. The Ledge route operated from 1906 to 1914, connecting the town of Thermopolis to the main Union Pacific Junction at Casper. It was never a profitable line. The terrain made maintenance difficult. Winter storms frequently suspended service, and the isolation of the route discouraged all but the most determined travelers. Most passengers were miners, ranchers, or territorial officials with business in the Hot Springs town. The trains ran twice weekly, departing Thermopolis on Wednesday and Saturday evenings, arriving in Casper the following morning. The railway kept detailed records. Manifests were prepared in triplicate, 1 copy for the departing station, 1 for the arriving station, and 1 carried by the conductor. Head counts were performed at departure, at the midpoint rest stop in Lysite, and upon arrival. Discrepancies were rare and always investigated. The Wyoming and Northwestern prided itself on accountability, a necessity given the dangerous terrain and the cost of search operations when something went wrong. William Ashby had served as conductor on the Ledge route for 3 years by December of 1911. He was 38 years old, unmarried, and known among colleagues for his meticulous nature. His logbooks, preserved in the Fremont County Historical Society archives, reveal a man obsessed with precision. He recorded not only passenger counts, but also weather conditions, track irregularities, and the exact times of every whistle signal. Fellow crew members described him as reliable to a fault, and the sort of man who counts his own heartbeats. On the evening of December 12, 1911, the Wednesday service departed Thermopolis at 6:15 with 46 ticketed passengers. Ashby performed his initial count as the train cleared the station and recorded the number in his logbook, 46. The manifest matched. The train began its slow climb toward the canyon rim. The first indication of irregularity appears in Ashby's logbook at 7:42. In his careful handwriting, he notes, "Second count conducted at milepost 17. Total passengers, 47. Recount performed. Confirmed, 47." Ashby did not panic. His training demanded that he identify the discrepancy and resolve it. A 47th passenger meant either a manifest error or an unticketed traveler, both situations requiring documentation and, potentially, fare collection. He began walking the length of the train, checking each passenger against the manifest. The train consisted of 4 cars, a baggage car, 2 standard coaches, and a first-class sleeper at the rear. Ashby started in the first coach and worked backward. His logbook entries for the next hour are unusually detailed, suggesting he was attempting to reconstruct his process for later review. He notes the names of passengers he recognized: a rancher named Bjorn Henriksen, a doctor's wife named Prudence Oyalaren, a territorial surveyor whose name he renders as Kowalczyk, first name unknown. He marks each as accounted for. By 8:30, Ashby had verified all 46 manifested passengers, yet his count remained 47. At 8:52, Ashby made the following entry: unmanifested passenger located, car 4, rear section, window seat, eastward facing, male, dark coat, hat, will not respond to inquiry, will not turn around. The entry is notable for what it does not contain: no description of the passenger's face, no estimate of age, no record of any verbal exchange, only the observation, repeated twice in slightly different phrasing: the passenger would not turn around. Ashby's logbook shows that he returned to car 4 at least 3 more times over the following 2 hours. Each entry grows shorter. At 9:17, passenger remains seated, has not moved. At 10:04, approached within 2 rows, passenger does not acknowledge. At 11:31, the final entry before arrival, cannot locate, sits in car 4, will not turn around. The train arrived at Casper Station at 6:47 on the morning of December 13th. Ashby performed his final head count as passengers disembarked. His logbook records the total, 46. The 47th passenger was gone. Ashby filed a discrepancy report with the station master at Casper, a man named Theodore Oduya, who had worked the Wyoming and Northwestern lines since their inception. Oduya's written response, preserved in the railway's operational archives, dismisses the incident as a counting error compounded by fatigue and poor lighting. He notes that Ashby appeared agitated but coherent and recommended no further action. But others on the train remembered something. Prudence Oyalaren, the doctor's wife, gave a statement to a local newspaper reporter 3 days after the incident, a statement that was never published but survives in the reporter's notes, now held at the University of Wyoming's American Heritage Center. She described seeing Ashby walk past her seat multiple times during the night, each time moving toward the rear of the train with an expression I can only describe as determined confusion. She also recalled noticing a figure in the rearward car whom she did not recognize. "A man in a dark coat," she said. "I assumed he was someone's husband. He sat very still. I remember thinking he must be asleep, though I never saw him move at all." When asked if she saw the man's face, Oyalaran hesitated before answering, "I don't believe he had one. I'm sure he did. But I cannot remember it. I cannot picture it at all." Bjorn Henriksen, the rancher, offered a different account. He told the same reporter that he had been seated in car 3 and had not seen any unusual passengers. However, he noted that the train had felt heavier than usual during the canyon crossing, a detail he attributed to possible freight in the baggage car. Railway records show the baggage car carried only standard parcels and mail, totaling less than 800 pounds. The railway conducted an internal review that concluded on December 20th. The review board, consisting of 3 company officials, determined that Ashby had made an honest error in arithmetic and that no 47th passenger had ever existed. They noted that the manifest was accurate, that all ticketed passengers had arrived safely, and that no unticketed individuals had been discovered at any point during the journey. The case was closed. William Ashby submitted his resignation on December 23, 1911. His letter, a single paragraph, offers no explanation beyond personal reasons. Railway officials accepted the resignation without comment. Ashby left Casper within the month and relocated to California, where census records show him working as a warehouse clerk in Oakland until his death in 1941. He never worked on a railroad again. In the decades since, researchers have attempted to verify or debunk the incident with limited success. The original logbook remains in the Fremont County Archives, and handwriting analysts have confirmed that all entries were made by the same person in consistent ink, suggesting they were written contemporaneously rather than added later. The manifest for December 12, 1911 has been lost. Neither the Thermopolis nor Casper copies have been located, and the conductor's copy presumably left with Ashby. Railway historians have noted one additional detail that has never been satisfactorily explained. The Wyoming and Northwestern maintained a practice of photographing each departing train, a promotional effort intended to document the company's operations for potential investors. The photograph from December 12, 1911, shows the train at the Thermopolis platform, passengers visible through the windows of the coaches. A careful count of the figures in the photograph yields 47. The 47th figure sits in the rearward car, face turned toward the window, features obscured by shadow and glass. Researchers have attempted to enhance the image using modern techniques, but the figure remains indistinct, a dark shape in a dark coat, occupying a seat that, according to all official records, should have been empty. The ledge route was abandoned in 1914 after a series of rock slides made the track impassable. The rails were salvaged, the stations were dismantled. Wind River Canyon eventually received a new railway line along the canyon floor, far below where the original track had run. The rimside route has returned to wilderness. Hikers who follow the old railbed report that it is a quiet place. Too quiet, some say, for a canyon known for its echoing acoustics. Sound does not carry there the way it should. Voices fall flat, footsteps make no echo, and occasionally those who walk the route at dusk describe seeing something in the distance ahead of them. A figure, perhaps, a shape in a dark coat, walking the same direction, never turning around, never quite close enough to identify. They count their party when they return to the trailhead. The number is always correct, but some of them admit quietly that during the hike they could have sworn there was one more. The logbook remains, the photograph remains, and somewhere along the canyon rim the count still doesn't add up, and perhaps it never will. Some sounds arrive before they happen. Sunrise, Wyoming sits in Platte County, approximately 4 miles north of the town of Hartville and 7 miles south of Guernsey. In its peak years, between 1900 and 1920, the town supported a population of nearly 900, miners, their families, and the merchants who served them. The Sunrise Mine extracted iron ore from the surrounding hills, feeding the furnaces of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company in Pueblo. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad operated a spur line to the mine, hauling ore cars down through the foothills to connect with the main line at Guernsey. The terrain around Sunrise is deceptive. The hills roll gently from a distance, but the valleys between them are sharp and sudden, carved by seasonal streams that have long since run dry. Sound behaves strangely in this landscape. Conversations carry across distances that seem impossible. A gunshot fired in one valley might echo from 3 directions. The Lakota people who traveled through this region called it the place where words return changed, though the precise meaning of this phrase has been debated by ethnographers for decades. By 1920, the Sunrise Mine was already in decline, the richest ore deposits had been exhausted, and the company was extracting lower-grade material at higher cost. Families began leaving, businesses closed. The railroad reduced its service from daily to 3 times weekly. Those who remained described a town that felt increasingly empty, as though the buildings themselves were slowly forgetting their purpose. It was during this period of decline that the whistles began. The first documented report comes from a letter written by Margaret Lindbergh, a school teacher who remained in Sunrise to serve the handful of children still enrolled in the town's one-room school. In March of 1921, she wrote to her sister in Cheyenne, "Last night I heard the train whistle at 2:30 in the morning. I thought it strange, as the next scheduled train is not until Thursday. I mentioned it to Mr. Okonkwo at the general store, and he said he heard it too. We agreed it must have been the wind playing tricks, though there was no wind that night." Similar accounts accumulated over the following years. Residents reported hearing train whistles at irregular hours, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes at dusk, occasionally in the middle of the night. The whistles were always distant but clear, carrying the distinctive 2-tone pattern that signaled a train's approach to a crossing. Those who heard them described the sound as too clean, as though it were somehow closer than it should have been, despite its apparent distance. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad received at least a dozen formal complaints between 1921 and 1926. Each complaint described the same phenomenon: whistles heard at times when no trains were operating. The railroad's responses, preserved in company archives now held at the Nebraska State Historical Society, follow a consistent pattern. Early letters dismiss the reports as acoustic anomalies common to hilly terrain. Later correspondence becomes terser, offering only the assurance that no unscheduled trains operate on the Sunrise Spur. A 1924 internal memorandum, however, suggests the company was less certain than its public responses indicated. The memo, addressed to the division superintendent in Lincoln, notes that multiple credible witnesses, including company employees, have reported auditory phenomena on the Sunrise Line that cannot be attributed to scheduled operations. The author, a junior executive named Franklin Reeves, recommended a formal investigation into possible acoustic properties of the terrain. No evidence suggests such an investigation was ever conducted. The reports might have remained a minor curiosity, a footnote in the history of a dying mining town, if not for the events of September 3, 1927. On the night of September 1st, at approximately 11:47, at least 7 residents of Sunrise reported hearing a train whistle. The sound came from the southwest, from the direction of the curve known locally as Draper's Bend, a sharp turn where the spur line descended through a narrow cut between 2 hills. The whistle was followed by what witnesses described as a terrible grinding, then silence. Several residents walked toward the sound, but found nothing. The tracks at Draper's Bend were empty and undisturbed. 2 days later, on the afternoon of September 3rd, a Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy maintenance train derailed at Draper's Bend. The locomotive left the tracks at the apex of the curve, pulling 2 equipment cars into the ravine below. 4 workers were killed: engineer Raymond Achterberg, fireman Thomas M. Bakey, and track inspectors Leonard Gustafson and William Padilla. A 5th worker, brakeman Joseph Yazzie, survived with serious injuries. The official accident report attributed the derailment to a failed rail joint, a fracture in the iron that had gone undetected during routine inspections. The report makes no mention of the whistles heard 2 nights earlier. It makes no mention of sunrise at all. But the residents remembered. Margaret Lindbergh, the schoolteacher, gave a statement to a reporter from the Guernsey Gazette 2 weeks after the accident. "We heard it happen before it happened," she said. "The whistle, the grinding, the silence. It was the same, exactly the same. I told Mr. Yazzie this when he was recovering in Hartville, and he went pale as a sheet. He said the last thing he remembered before the crash was hearing his own train whistle, but he was certain no one had pulled the cord." Joseph Yazzie's own account, recorded in a 1932 interview with a WPA folklorist, is more guarded but no less unsettling. "I don't talk about that day much," he said, "but I'll tell you this. When we came around that curve, I heard our whistle sound, clear as anything. Engineer Ray looked at me and asked who pulled it. I said I didn't know. Then the whole world went sideways." Yazzie paused before adding, "The whistle came from ahead of us, from down the track, like it was waiting." The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy made no public statement connecting the accident to the reported phenomena. But internal documents tell a different story. In October of 1927, the company commissioned a survey of the Sunrise Spur to assess long-term operational viability. The survey, completed in December, recommended immediate discontinuation of service pending geological and acoustic analysis. No acoustic analysis was ever performed. The Sunrise Spur was closed in February of 1928. The official reason given was insufficient freight volume to justify maintenance costs. The Sunrise Mine closed permanently in 1930. The town was abandoned by 1932. Today, only foundations remain, concrete slabs and rusted machinery scattered across the hills, slowly being reclaimed by sagebrush and prairie grass. The railbed is still visible, a faint depression in the landscape that curves through Draper's Bend exactly as it did 90 years ago. Hikers and history enthusiasts occasionally visit the site. Most describe it as peaceful, if melancholy, a quiet monument to a vanished industry. But some have reported experiences that echo the accounts from the 1920s. In 1983, a geology student named Patricia Moreau from the University of Wyoming visited Draper's Bend as part of a field survey. In her personal journal, later donated to the university archives, she describes hearing a sound like a train whistle, distant but distinct, while taking soil samples near the old curve. She noted the time, 3:22 in the afternoon. She also noted that she was alone and that the nearest active rail line was more than 12 miles away. A local rancher named Harold Swenson reported a similar experience in 1997. He told the Platte County Record that he had been checking fence lines near the old town site when he heard a whistle and a crash like metal on metal. He rode toward the sound and found nothing. 3 days later, a freight train on the main line near Guernsey derailed due to a mechanical failure. No one was killed, but 2 crew members were injured. Swenson told the newspaper he didn't believe in ghosts. "But I believe in what I heard," he said, "and I believe in what happened after." The railroad has never acknowledged any connection between the sunrise phenomena and subsequent accidents. Acoustic engineers have suggested that the unusual terrain around the town might create conditions for atmospheric ducting, a phenomenon in which sound waves travel farther and clearer than normal due to temperature inversions. This might explain why distant train whistles could be heard with unusual clarity. It does not explain why they would be heard before the trains that made them existed. It does not explain why they would precede disasters by exactly 2 days. And it does not explain the testimony of Joseph Yazzie, who spent the remaining 43 years of his life refusing to board a train, and who told the WPA folklorist One final detail that was omitted from the published record but preserved in the interviewer's handwritten notes. "The whistle I heard that day," Yazzie said, "it wasn't just ahead of us on the track. It was ahead of us in time. I know how that sounds. But I heard our own whistle, and I heard it before we made it, like the mountain already knew what was going to happen, like it was trying to warn us, or maybe—" He stopped. The interviewer noted that Yazzie's hands were trembling. Maybe it was trying to remember. The notes end there. The folklorist moved on to other interviews, other towns, other stories. Sunrise continued its slow collapse into the earth. But the hills around Draper's Bend remain, and on certain nights, when the air is still and the temperature drops just so, visitors report hearing something carried on the silence, a sound that might be wind, might be memory, might be something that hasn't happened yet. They check the schedules. No trains are coming. They check the news 3 days later, and sometimes they wish they hadn't. The tracks are gone. The town is gone. But the echo remains, arriving early, as it always did, with warnings no one learned how to read. Some images capture what was never there. Bitter Creek is not a town in any meaningful sense. It is a name on a map, a whistle stop, a place where the Union Pacific Railroad once maintained a water tank and a small section house for track workers. Located in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, approximately 40 miles east of Rock Springs, the site sits in the heart of the Red Desert, a vast wind-scoured expanse of sagebrush, alkali flats, and eroded buttes that stretches for nearly 9,000 square miles. The creek itself is often dry, a seasonal trickle that briefly carries snowmelt before vanishing into the sandy soil. Spanish traders who crossed this region in the 18th century called it El Arroyo Amargo, the bitter stream, for the alkaline taste of its water. The railroad arrived in 1868, part of the original transcontinental route. For decades, Bitter Creek served as a coaling station, a place where locomotives paused to take on fuel before the long climb toward the Continental Divide. A small community grew around the station, never more than a few hundred residents, mostly railroad employees and their families. By the 1940s, the transition to diesel locomotives had rendered the coaling station obsolete. The population dwindled. The section house stood empty more often than not. Bitter Creek became what it had always been, a name, a location, a point on a line between places that mattered. In January of 1948, the Union Pacific hired a photographer named Edwin Haroldson to document conditions along the Wyoming Division. Haroldson was 43 years old, a commercial photographer based in Salt Lake City who had previously done work for the Denver and Rio Grande Western and the Southern Pacific. His assignment was straightforward: travel the line between Ogden and Cheyenne, photographing track conditions, station facilities, and equipment for a company report on infrastructure maintenance needs. He was given a travel pass, a list of priority locations, and 200 sheets of 4x5 film. Haroldson departed Salt Lake City on January 19th and spent the following 2 weeks working his way east. His surviving correspondence, letters to his wife, Eleanor, preserved by their daughter and later donated to the Utah State Historical Society, describes the assignment as routine but lonely. He photographed bridges, switches, and signal equipment. He documented snow fences and drainage culverts. He took portraits of station agents and section crews. By all accounts, the work proceeded without incident until he reached the stretch between Rock Springs and Green River. On February 2, 1948, Haroldson spent the day photographing along a 15-mile section of track that included the Bitter Creek whistle stop. His notes from that day, recovered from his equipment case after his death, indicate that he exposed approximately 40 frames, images of the track bed, the abandoned water tank, and the surrounding terrain. He made no mention of photographing any trains or passenger cars. His notes specifically state, No rolling stock present. Line quiet. Return to Rock Springs by 4:30. The photographs were developed at a Union Pacific facility in Omaha 2 weeks later. A technician named Dolores Kimura processed the negatives and prepared contact sheets for review. According to a statement she gave years later to a Railway Historical Society, she noticed the anomaly immediately. Frames 72 through 102 were wrong, Kimura said in a 1989 interview. Everything else on the roll was normal: track, buildings, landscape. But those 31 frames were all the same image: the interior of a passenger car, empty seats, windows, luggage racks. The same car, the same angle, 31 times in a row. Kimura assumed a processing error or double exposure. She flagged the images for review and continued her work. The contact sheets were forwarded to the publicity department, where they came to the attention of a supervisor named Martin Bachmann. Bachmann's response, documented in an internal memorandum dated February 20th, 1948, was immediate. Pull all negatives from Haraldson assignment. Do not print, do not distribute, forward to operations for review. The negatives were confiscated. Edwin Haraldson was summoned to Omaha for an interview on February 25th. No transcript of that interview has ever been located. But Haraldson's letters to his wife describe his confusion and frustration. "They keep asking me about a passenger car," he wrote on February 26th. "I told them I never photographed a passenger car. I never saw a passenger car. There was no train at Bitter Creek. The line was empty." He added, "They showed me the contact sheets. I don't know what those images are. I don't know how they got on my film. But I didn't take them. I would remember." The Union Pacific never released the photographs. The negatives were filed in the company's archives in Omaha, where they remained until a 1973 reorganization. During that process, the file containing Haraldson's work was marked as incomplete. The negatives for frames 72 through 102 were missing. No record indicates when or how they were removed. 3 prints survived. How they escaped confiscation remains unclear. Dolores Kimura denied making any unauthorized copies, though she admitted in her 1989 interview that she had been curious enough to look closely before surrendering the materials. The 3 prints surfaced in 1962 when a Union Pacific retiree named George Castellanos sold a collection of railroad memorabilia to a dealer in Denver. Among the items was an envelope containing 3 4x5 prints, unlabeled, showing the interior of what appears to be a 1920s or 1930s passenger coach. The images are nearly identical. Each shows the same angle, a view down the center aisle of an empty passenger car facing the rear. The seats are upholstered in dark fabric. The windows are frosted, suggesting cold weather. The luggage racks are empty. The lighting is flat and gray, as though filtered through heavy clouds. In each image, a single seat, the 3rd row on the left, appears to be occupied, not by a person, by a shape, a form made of what appears to be water or melted snow, pooled on the seat and dripping onto the floor. The shape is vaguely human, a torso, shoulders, the suggestion of a bowed head. In one of the prints, the shape seems more defined. In another, it appears to be dissolving, collapsing into liquid. In the third, only a wet stain remains. Photography experts who have examined the prints have offered varying interpretations. Some suggest double exposure, though the technical characteristics of the images argue against this. Others propose that the figure is simply a pattern of condensation on the seat fabric, interpreted by the human eye as a human form. A 1991 analysis commissioned by a railway historical journal concluded that the prints were genuine photographic artifacts of unknown origin and subject. Edwin Haraldson continued working as a commercial photographer until his death in 1977. He never discussed the Bitter Creek images publicly, though his daughter later revealed that he had kept a single item from the assignment, his original field notes from February 2nd, 1948. In the margin of those notes, in handwriting that appears shakier than his usual script, Haraldson had added a single line at some point after the original entries. I remember now. There was a car. It was behind me. I never turned around. No passenger trains were scheduled on the Bitter Creek section on February 2nd, 1948. Union Pacific records confirm that no rolling stock of any kind was present on that stretch of track between January 30th and February 5th. The nearest passenger service was a daily train that passed through Rock Springs at 6:15 in the morning and Green River at 7:40, hours before Haraldson arrived and miles from where he was working. Yet the images exist. 31 frames of a passenger car that should not have been there, captured by a photographer who insists he never saw it. Researchers have attempted to identify the specific car model shown in the photographs. The interior design suggests a Pullman coach from the mid-1920s, a type that was largely retired from active service by 1940. Several identical cars were, however, involved in a 1929 accident near Bitter Creek, when a westbound passenger train derailed during a snowstorm. The accident killed 11 passengers and 2 crew members. One of the dead was never identified, a male figure found in the third row of the second passenger car, so badly frozen that identification was impossible. The body was buried in an unmarked grave at the Rock Springs Cemetery. The coroner's report noted that the unidentified man appeared to have been dead before the derailment. His clothing was soaked through and ice had formed in the folds of his coat. But there was no snow inside the passenger car and no broken windows that would have admitted moisture. Cause of death: exposure, the report concluded. Circumstances: undetermined. The seat where the body was found was the third row on the left. The section of track near Bitter Creek remains in active use today. Freight trains pass through regularly, carrying coal and soda ash from the mines of southwestern Wyoming. The water tank is gone. The section house collapsed decades ago. There is nothing at Bitter Creek now except the rails, the desert, and the wind. But Union Pacific employees who work that stretch of line have, over the years, reported occasional anomalies with their onboard cameras and recording equipment. Digital images sometimes show artifacts, smears of light, unexplained reflections, what one engineer described in a 2015 incident report as a shape in the window of a car we weren't pulling. The reports are always filed. The images are always deleted. The trains keep running. And somewhere in a private collection, 3 photographs remain, 31 frames reduced to 3, showing an empty passenger car, a melting figure, and a mystery that never dried up. The negatives are gone. The photographer is gone. But the shape in the third row remains, frozen, dissolving, waiting to be seen by a camera that was never supposed to be there. Some moments refuse to pass. Dale Creek Bridge was, for a brief period in American history, the most famous railway structure in the world. Completed in 1868 as part of the original Transcontinental Railroad, the bridge spanned a narrow but formidable gorge in Albany County, Wyoming, approximately 20 miles northwest of Cheyenne. The gorge itself was not wide, only 700 feet across, but it was deep, cutting 130 feet down through granite and shale to the thin ribbon of Dale Creek below. The original bridge was a timber trestle, a latticework of wooden beams and iron bolts that swayed visibly when trains crossed. Passengers described the experience as crossing on a spider's web and looking directly into the throat of the earth. The Union Pacific replaced the timber structure with an iron trestle in 1876, a more stable design that nonetheless retained the original's dizzying height. The bridge became a tourist attraction. Photographers sold stereoscopic images of trains crossing the span. travelers detoured specifically to experience the crossing, pressing their faces to windows as the ground fell away beneath them. For 30 years, Dale Creek Bridge was a symbol of American engineering ambition, proof that no obstacle, however deep or treacherous, could stop the railroad's westward march. It was also, by any measure, a dangerous place to work. The bridge required constant maintenance. The Wyoming wind, funneled through the gorge, stressed every joint and rivet. Winter ice expanded in cracks, weakening connections. Summer heat warped the iron. A permanent crew of 6 men was assigned to the Dale Creek section, responsible for inspections, repairs, and the grim task of recovering debris, and occasionally bodies, from the gorge below. Between 1868 and 1900, at least 14 workers died in accidents on or near the bridge. Their names are recorded in Union Pacific personnel files, though the circumstances of their deaths are often noted only as fell or struck by equipment. Thomas Greenlee became the 15th on the night of October 7, 1889. Greenlee was 26 years old, a brakeman with 4 years of service on the Wyoming Division. His job was among the most dangerous on the railroad, climbing between moving cars to set and release handbrakes, often at night, often in poor weather, always with the knowledge that a single misstep meant death. Brakemen in this era had a life expectancy significantly lower than other railroad workers. They knew the risks. Most accepted them as the cost of steady pay. On the night in question, Greenlee was working the rear section of a westbound freight train approaching Dale Creek Bridge. The train had slowed for the crossing, standard procedure given the bridge's structural limitations, and Greenlee had moved between cars to adjust a brake that was dragging. Somewhere in the darkness, he lost his footing. He fell between the cars and under the wheels. The body was recovered the following morning. Greenlee had been killed instantly, his injuries consistent with being struck by the undercarriage of a moving freight car. His personal effects were collected and inventoried: a tobacco pouch, a small knife, a photograph of a woman believed to be his sister, and a silver pocket watch. The watch had stopped at 3:47. This detail was noted in the accident report filed by the section foreman, a man named Arvid Johansson. Johansson recorded that the watch's crystal was cracked, likely from impact, and that the hands were frozen in position. He sent the watch, along with Greenlee's other belongings, to the brakeman's family in Ohio. The report was filed, and Thomas Greenlee became another name in the long ledger of railroad dead. What happened over the following 11 years was not immediately apparent. It emerged only later, when a Union Pacific clerk named Esther Mwangi was tasked with compiling accident statistics for an 1899 safety review. Mwangi, known among her colleagues for her meticulous attention to detail, noticed a pattern in the Dale Creek records that she initially assumed was a clerical error. Every accident at Dale Creek Bridge since Greenlee's death had occurred at 3:47 in the morning. Mwangi documented 7 incidents between October of 1889 and March of 1899. A coupling failure that injured 2 workers, 3:47. A rail fracture that derailed an empty boxcar, 3:47. A track walker struck by an unscheduled locomotive, 3:47. A maintenance platform collapse that killed 1 man and crippled another, 3:47. In each case, the time was recorded by the crew involved, noted in official reports, and filed without comment. The probability of 7 consecutive accidents occurring at the same minute, out of 1,440 minutes in a day, was, as Mwangi calculated, approximately 1 in 450 trillion. She brought her findings to her supervisor, a man named Donald Oyalaran, who reviewed the records and confirmed her analysis. Oyalaran's response, preserved in a memorandum dated April 3, 1899, is remarkable for its restraint. The statistical anomaly identified by Miss Mwangi has been verified. No explanation is apparent. Recommend continued monitoring. Continued monitoring revealed 3 additional incidents over the following year, all at 3:47, a brake failure, a signal malfunction, a fall from the bridge itself, a young worker named Peter Lindqvist, who slipped on ice-covered planking and dropped into the gorge. His body was recovered the following morning. His watch, like Greenlee's, had stopped at 3:47. Lindqvist had not owned a pocket watch. His family confirmed this. The watch found clutched in his hand was later identified through its serial number as the same watch that had been sent to Thomas Greenlee's family in Ohio 11 years earlier. How it came to be in Wyoming in the hand of a man who had never met Greenlee and had no connection to his family was never determined. Greenlee's sister, contacted by Union Pacific investigators, insisted the watch had been buried with her brother's other effects in the family plot. She refused to discuss the matter further. The Union Pacific did not release these findings publicly. Internal documents suggest that company officials were divided on how to interpret the pattern. Some attributed it to coincidence, arguing that any sufficiently large data set would contain apparent anomalies. Others proposed that the original accident times had been recorded incorrectly and that clerks had simply repeated the error. A smaller faction, represented in the archives only by unsigned marginalia, suggested that the phenomenon was beyond the scope of rational explanation and recommended discontinuation of night operations in the Dale Creek section. No official action was taken. The trains continued to run. In the summer of 1900, the Union Pacific made a decision that had been debated for years. The Dale Creek Bridge would be replaced. Not repaired, not reinforced, but entirely demolished. A new line would be constructed through a nearby cut, eliminating the bridge crossing altogether. The official justification was operational efficiency. The new route would be shorter and less prone to weather delays. But internal correspondence reveals another consideration. A letter from Division Superintendent Walter Yaboa to the company president, dated June 15, 1900, contains a single relevant sentence. "The situation at Dale Creek has become untenable, and I recommend the most permanent solution available." The bridge was demolished in September of 1900. The iron was salvaged. The stone abutments were left to crumble. The new line opened in October, bypassing the gorge entirely. Dale Creek, the obstacle that had challenged the Transcontinental Railroad for 32 years, was no longer on the map. The accidents at 3:47 stopped. Not gradually, not with a final incident. They simply ceased. The new Dale Creek section, the cut that replaced the bridge, has operated for over a century without a single accident at that precise time. Union Pacific statisticians, reviewing the data in 1952, noted the abrupt end of the pattern and offered no interpretation. Thomas Greenlee's pocket watch was never recovered. The watch found in Peter Lindqvist's hand was cataloged as evidence stored in a Union Pacific security facility in Omaha and subsequently lost during a 1943 inventory reorganization. No photographs of it exist. No detailed description survives beyond the original notation. Silver pocket watch, crystal cracked, hand stopped at 3:47. The site of the original Dale Creek Bridge is accessible today via hiking trails in the Pole Mountain area of Medicine Bow National Forest. The stone abutments remain, though they are weathered and partially collapsed. The gorge is quieter now. No trains, no work crews, no machinery. Visitors describe it as peaceful, even beautiful, a hidden valley that most travelers never see. But some who have camped near the old bridge site report experiences they find difficult to explain. A hiker named Sandra Okonkwo, writing in a 2008 trail journal later posted online, described waking in her tent at exactly 3:47 according to my phone, to the sound of a train whistle and wheels on iron, very close, very clear. She was alone. The nearest active rail line was more than 6 miles away. Others have reported similar experiences, the phantom sounds of a train crossing a bridge that no longer exists, always in the small hours of the morning, always at the same precise time. The Union Pacific has never commented on these reports. The official position is that Dale Creek Bridge was demolished in 1900 and that no unusual incidents are associated with the site. Somewhere in a storage facility, in a box of uncatalogued railway artifacts, a silver pocket watch may still exist, its crystal cracked, its hands frozen, its mechanism forever marking the moment that Thomas Greenlee fell into the dark. Or perhaps the watch is gone, dissolved into history like the bridge itself. But the minute remains, 3:47, suspended, waiting. Some moments, it seems, refuse to pass. The bridge is gone, the watch is lost, but the time endures, 3:47 repeated in incident reports and restless dreams, an instant that never quite finishes happening. Some deaths leave no evidence they ever occurred. Carbon, Wyoming, no longer exists on any modern map. The town once stood in Carbon County, a county that still bears its name, approximately 15 miles east of Rawlins, along a spur line of the Union Pacific Railroad. Founded in 1868 to support coal mining operations that fueled the Transcontinental Railroad, Carbon grew quickly into a settlement of nearly 3,000 residents by the mid-1880s. The town had a school, 2 churches, a company store, and rows of modest wooden houses that clung to the hillside above the mine entrance. For 30 years, Carbon was a place where men descended into the earth each morning and emerged each evening covered in black dust, their lungs slowly filling with the substance that gave them work. The coal seams beneath Carbon were rich but treacherous. The mines extended more than a mile underground, following veins that twisted through unstable shale and sandstone. Methane gas collected in pockets. Timber supports rotted. The company that operated the mines, the Union Pacific Coal Company, maintained safety protocols that were, by the standards of the era, considered adequate. By modern standards, they were almost non-existent. Disasters were common. An 1881 explosion killed 15 men. An 1884 tunnel collapse killed 9 more. The miners who worked these shafts understood that death was part of the job. They told dark jokes about it. They named their children quickly, knowing they might not live to see them grow. They accepted the risks because the alternative was poverty, and poverty killed more slowly, but just as surely. By 1899, the easiest coal had been extracted, and the company was pushing deeper into increasingly dangerous territory. Production quotas increased. Safety inspections grew less frequent. The miners grumbled, but continued to descend. They had no other choice. On the morning of November 14, 1899, a Union Pacific work train departed Rawlins at 5:15, carrying 28 miners to the Carbon shafts for the early shift. The train consisted of a single locomotive and 2 passenger cars, older coaches that had been retired from regular service and repurposed for worker transport. The journey was short, approximately 40 minutes, traversing a landscape of brown hills and frozen sagebrush under a sky that witnesses later described as heavy and unusually still. The train arrived at the Carbon depot at 5:58. The depot master, a man named Frederick Johansson, watched the train pull in and noticed nothing unusual. He recorded the arrival time in his log, as he did every morning. He waited for the miners to disembark. They didn't. Johansson later testified that he waited approximately 5 minutes before approaching the train. He assumed the men were finishing conversations, gathering their equipment, or simply slow to rise on a cold morning. When he reached the first passenger car and looked through the window, he stopped. The miners were seated in rows, exactly as they would have been during the journey. Their eyes were open. Their hands rested on their laps or on the armrests. Several had lunch pails at their feet. One man, later identified as Elias Okonkwo, was holding a newspaper, his fingers still gripping the edges. None of them were breathing. Johansson's testimony, preserved in the Carbon County coroner's records, describes the scene with remarkable restraint. I opened the door and called out. No one answered. I walked the aisle and touched the shoulder of the nearest man. He was cold. They were all cold. I have seen dead men before. These men were dead, but they did not look dead. They looked like they were waiting for something. The alarm was raised. By 7 o'clock, company officials, a doctor from Rawlins, and the county sheriff had all arrived at the carbon depot. The 28 miners were examined where they sat. All were confirmed dead. All showed the same characteristics: eyes open, expressions neutral, bodies positioned naturally. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of panic, no indication that any of the men had attempted to flee or call for help. The doctor, a man named Harrison Volkman, conducted preliminary examinations on site and later performed detailed autopsies on 6 of the victims. His report, filed on November 17, 1899, remains one of the most unusual documents in Wyoming medical history. I have examined the bodies of 28 adult males, ages ranging from approximately 19 to 57 years, Volkman wrote. All subjects display complete cessation of vital functions. Cause of death, undetermined. There are no visible injuries, no evidence of asphyxiation, no signs of toxic exposure, no indications of cardiac arrest or stroke. Internal examination reveals no abnormalities of any kind. All organs appear healthy and functional. Blood samples show no presence of known poisons or intoxicants. Volkman concluded with a statement that would be cited in medical journals for decades. The passengers appear to have simply stopped. There is no physical explanation for why these men are dead. They simply are. The Union Pacific Coal Company launched an immediate investigation. Suspicion initially fell on the train itself, specifically on the possibility of a gas leak from the locomotive. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a known hazard, and the symptoms could, in some cases, cause victims to lose consciousness without visible distress. But investigators found the locomotive in perfect working order. The passenger cars were ventilated and showed no signs of fume accumulation. Air samples taken from inside the coaches revealed nothing unusual. The theory was abandoned within 24 hours. No official replacement theory was ever proposed. Interviews with potential witnesses yielded little useful information. The locomotive engineer, a man named Gunnar Lindqvist, and the fireman, Solomon Abrams, were both found alive and unharmed in the engine cab. Neither man had entered the passenger cars during the journey. Both reported that the trip had been uneventful. No unusual sounds, no stops, no incidents of any kind. Lindqvist told investigators that he had assumed the miners were quiet because they were tired. Abrams said simply, "I didn't hear anything. It was the quietest trip I ever made." When asked to elaborate on this observation, Abrams hesitated. The interview transcript notes a pause of approximately 30 seconds before he continued. "Usually you hear something from the back, men talking, laughing, coughing. The cars were full, 28 men. But I didn't hear a sound the whole way, not one word. I thought maybe the wind was covering it up, but there wasn't any wind that morning." The investigation was closed on November 16th, 48 hours after the incident. The official finding attributed the deaths to unknown natural causes. The 28 miners were buried in the Carbon Cemetery over the following week. Most of the funerals were small, attended only by immediate family. Several of the men had no family in Carbon, and their graves were marked with simple wooden crosses that have long since rotted away. The town of Carbon never recovered. The mine continued operations for 3 more years, but workers were increasingly reluctant to take the morning train. Absenteeism rose. Production fell. When a series of underground fires broke out in 1901 and 1902, the company chose not to fight them. The mines were sealed. The workers were relocated. By 1903, Carbon was empty. Today, the site of Carbon is accessible via a dirt road off Wyoming Highway 76. The foundations of a few buildings remain, along with the cemetery, now a protected historic site, maintained by the Carbon County Historical Society. The graves of the 28 miners are located in the northeastern section, arranged in two neat rows. Several of the original headstones survive, though the names are weathered and difficult to read. Visitors to the cemetery have, over the years, reported a consistent and peculiar observation. The area around the miners' graves is unusually quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. Sounds seem to die before they reach that corner of the cemetery. Conversations become difficult. Even the wind, which blows almost constantly across the Wyoming plains, seems to diminish within a certain radius. A graduate student in acoustics from the University of Wyoming visited the site in 2012 as part of a research project on environmental sound propagation. Her measurements, documented in an unpublished thesis, showed that ambient noise levels dropped by approximately 12 decibels within 20 feet of the miners' graves, a reduction that she noted was inconsistent with the terrain, vegetation, and atmospheric conditions. She offered no explanation and did not return to the site. The coroner's report from 1899 was rediscovered in 1978 during an archive reorganization at the Carbon County Courthouse. It had been misfiled for nearly 8 decades. The report included one detail that had not been noted in any contemporary news accounts, a handwritten addendum by Dr. Harrison Volkman, apparently added sometime after the main report was completed. "I have not been able to sleep since examining these men," Volkman wrote. "It is not the deaths that trouble me. I have seen death many times. It is the silence. When I opened each man's chest, I expected to find something, damage, disease, evidence of the violence that life does to a body over time. But there was nothing. These men were not killed. They were not even harmed. They were simply made quiet, as if someone or something had reached inside them and turned off the sound." Volkman practiced medicine in Rawlins until 1912, when he retired and moved to California. He never spoke publicly about the Carbon incident. His personal papers, donated to the Rawlins Library after his death in 1931, contain no further references to the case. The locomotive and passenger cars from the November 14th train were removed from service immediately after the incident. The locomotive was scrapped in 1904. The 2 passenger cars were reportedly stored in a Union Pacific maintenance yard in Omaha, where they remained for decades. A railway historian who attempted to locate the cars in 1986 found no record of their disposition. They are not listed in any scrapping manifest. They are not recorded as having been sold or transferred. As far as official documents are concerned, the 2 cars simply ceased to exist at some point between 1904 and 1950, the same way the 28 miners aboard them ceased to exist on a cold November morning without cause, without warning, without a single sound. Nice. Wyoming, the town is gone. The mine is sealed. But the silence remains, settled over the graves of 28 men who arrived at their destination and never stood up, whose deaths left no mark, whose final journey was so quiet that even the men driving the train didn't know they were carrying the dead. Some places exist only because we name them. The stretch of Union Pacific track between Laramie and Medicine Bow crosses some of the most unremarkable terrain in Wyoming. The land is flat, or nearly so, a high plateau of sagebrush and bunch grass that extends to the horizon in every direction. There are no mountains here, no rivers, no distinctive features to catch the eye or anchor the memory. Ranchers who work this country describe it as the kind of place you drive through without remembering. The railroad, when it arrived in 1868, laid track in straight lines that ran for miles without deviation. There was nothing to go around. Mile markers were installed along the route to help crews identify their position, report problems, and coordinate operations. Each marker was a simple wooden post with a painted number, placed at precise 1-mile intervals, measured from the division's origin point in Cheyenne. The markers were functional, not decorative. They existed to impose human order on a landscape that offered no natural reference points. Mile marker 77 stood approximately 12 miles west of Laramie, in a section of track that passed through particularly empty country. The nearest settlement was a ranch house 3 miles to the south. The nearest town was Laramie itself, visible on clear days as a faint smudge on the eastern horizon. There was nothing at mile marker 77. No curve, no grade change, no bridge or crossing. Just track, extending east and west into the distance, and a wooden post with the number 77 painted in fading white. The first documented incident occurred on March 8, 1915. A westbound freight train carrying coal from the mines near Hanna derailed at 3:22 in the afternoon. The locomotive and 4 cars left the track, scattering debris across the right-of-way. The engineer, a man named Victor Lindqvist, and his fireman, Abraham Oduya, were both injured but survived. In his incident report, Lindqvist stated that the train had been traveling at normal speed when he felt a sudden resistance, as if something were holding the wheels. He applied the brakes, but the locomotive had already begun to tip. The derailment occurred directly adjacent to mile marker 77. Investigators examined the track and found no defects. The rails were properly aligned, the ties were sound, the ballast was undisturbed. The official finding attributed the derailment to unknown mechanical failure and recommended enhanced inspections of the locomotive's wheel assemblies. 3 months later, on June 14th, a passenger train made an unscheduled stop at the same location. The engineer Harold Moreau reported that his instruments showed a sudden loss of steam pressure, forcing him to halt the train until the problem could be diagnosed. When the fireman inspected the boiler, he found nothing wrong. Pressure readings returned to normal within minutes. The stop lasted 11 minutes. It occurred at mile marker 77. The incidents accumulated. In September of 1917, a track inspector named Samuel Achterberg was walking the line on a routine patrol when he reported seeing a figure standing on the track near mile marker 77. He waved and shouted, but the figure did not respond. As he approached, it vanished. Achterberg, a 15-year veteran of the railroad, filed a report describing the sighting and noting that he had not been drinking and was not prone to hallucinations. The report was filed without comment. In August of 1921, another derailment occurred, this time a maintenance car carrying 6 workers. The car left the track at low speed, injuring 2 men. The cause was never determined. The location was mile marker 77. In February of 1924, an eastbound freight train stopped abruptly when the engineer, a man named Douglas M. Becky, applied emergency brakes after seeing a large obstruction on the track ahead. Mbeki later described the obstruction as a dark mass, roughly the size of a boxcar, blocking both rails. When the train came to rest and Mbeki walked forward to investigate, he found nothing. The track was clear. Snow on either side of the rails was undisturbed. By the late 1920s, the Union Pacific had accumulated a file on mile marker 77 that ran to more than 40 pages. The incidents followed no discernible pattern. They occurred in different seasons, at different times of day, involving different crews and different types of rolling stock. The only common element was the location, a spot on the map that, by all evidence, should have been identical to the miles of track on either side of it. Internal memoranda from this period reveal a growing unease among company officials. A 1929 letter from the division superintendent, Walter Okonkwo, to the operations manager in Omaha contains a telling passage. "I have no explanation to offer for the recurrent difficulties at MM 77. The track has been inspected repeatedly and found sound. The terrain presents no unusual challenges, yet incidents continue to occur at this precise location with a frequency that exceeds statistical probability by a significant margin. I recommend that this matter be referred to the engineering department for further study. No study was ever conducted, but in 1932, following a final incident, a sudden stop reported by engineer Francis Kowalczyk, who described hearing voices on the track that compelled him to brake, the Union Pacific made an unusual decision. They removed mile marker 77. The action was carried out quietly in the spring of 1933. A maintenance crew pulled up the wooden post and renumbered the subsequent markers so that mile marker 76 was followed by mile marker 78. The stretch of track that had been designated as mile 77 simply ceased to exist as a named location. It became part of mile 76, absorbed into a longer segment that erased the troublesome designation. The incidents stopped. No derailments, no unexplained stops, no phantom obstructions were reported on that section of track after the renumbering. The file on mile marker 77 was closed in 1935 with a notation that read, "Issue resolved through administrative action. No further monitoring required." The Union Pacific never publicly acknowledged the renumbering or the reasons behind it. But railroad employees who worked the Wyoming division in subsequent decades passed down stories about the mile that wasn't there. New engineers were sometimes warned by veterans to watch yourself between 76 and 78. The warnings were delivered with a wry smile, as if the speaker didn't quite believe what he was saying, but felt obligated to say it anyway. The matter might have remained a footnote in railroad folklore if not for a surveying project undertaken in 1968. The Wyoming Department of Transportation commissioned a comprehensive survey of railroad crossings as part of a highway improvement initiative. A team led by a surveyor named Eleanor Sandoval was assigned to document the Union Pacific right-of-way between Cheyenne and Rawlins. Sandoval's team used standard equipment of the era, theodolites, measuring chains, and early electronic distance meters. When the team reached the section between mile markers 76 and 78, their instruments began to malfunction. Sandoval's field notes, preserved in the Wyoming State Archives, describe the problems in clinical detail. The theodolite would not hold calibration. The electronic distance meter returned inconsistent readings. Compass needles drifted. One member of the team, a junior surveyor named Robert Nguyen, reported that his watch stopped and restarted multiple times during the hour they spent at the site. Sandoval ordered the team to move on and return later with recalibrated equipment. They returned 3 days later. The same problems occurred. Sandoval eventually completed the survey by working around the troublesome section, taking measurements from positions farther east and west, and interpolating the data for the gap. Her final report includes a footnote that has puzzled researchers ever since. Reliable measurements could not be obtained for approximately 1/4 mile of track in the vicinity of the former mile marker 77. Equipment failures and anomalous readings persisted despite multiple attempts with different instruments. Cause unknown. Area omitted from detailed survey. Similar difficulties have been reported by surveyors and researchers who have attempted to study the site in subsequent years. A 1989 geological survey encountered instrument problems. A 2004 study of soil composition was abandoned after repeated equipment failures. A graduate student in geography who attempted to map the area using GPS in 2011 found that her receiver consistently lost satellite lock within a specific zone, a zone that, when plotted on historical maps, corresponded almost exactly to the location of the former mile marker 77. The Union Pacific continues to operate freight trains through this section of track without reported incident. The renumbering appears to have resolved whatever problem once existed, or at least relocated it to a place that no longer has a name. But there are those who believe that naming is precisely the issue. A retired railroad historian named Martin Johansen, who spent 3 decades researching the Union Pacific's Wyoming operations, developed a theory before his death in 2017. In an unpublished manuscript found among his papers, Johansen proposed that certain locations possess what he called accumulated significance, a quality that emerges when human attention is repeatedly focused on a specific point. Mile markers, he suggested, were particularly prone to this phenomenon because they imposed artificial specificity on undifferentiated landscape. Mile marker 77 became a problem, Johansen wrote, because we insisted on its existence. We named it, we numbered it, we made it a place. And something, whether a glitch in probability, a fold in physical law, or something else entirely, responded to that naming. When we unnamed it, when we removed the marker and pretended the 77th mile didn't exist, the problem ceased. But the location remains. It has simply become invisible. Johansen's theory has not been embraced by mainstream researchers who generally dismiss the mile marker 77 incidents as a combination of coincidence, mechanical failure, and folklore embellishment. The Union Pacific has never commented on the historical incidents or the renumbering. The track still runs through that empty stretch of Wyoming plateau. Trains pass through daily, carrying freight between Laramie and Medicine Bow. Engineers report nothing unusual. The landscape offers no landmarks, no features, no reason to pay attention to any particular spot. But somewhere between mile marker 76 and mile marker 78, there is a place that used to have a name. The wooden post is gone. The number has been erased from official records. The mile itself has been distributed, absorbed, forgotten. And yet the instruments still fail. The compasses still drift. The satellite signals still drop. Something is there. It simply refuses to be counted. The marker is gone. The number is gone. But the mile remains, unmapped, unnamed, waiting in the space between 76 and 78, occupying a location that officially no longer exists. Some journeys end before they begin. Evanston, Wyoming sits in the southwestern corner of the state, pressed against the Utah border in a narrow valley carved by the Bear River. The town was founded in 1868 as a division point for the Union Pacific Railroad, a place where locomotives were serviced, crews were changed, and passengers could stretch their legs during the long journey across the continent. By the 1920s, Evanston had grown into a modest but respectable community of nearly 4,000 residents, railroad workers, ranchers, merchants, and the professionals who served them. The station was the heart of the town, a solid brick building with a covered platform where eastbound and westbound trains paused several times daily. The station agent in 1921 was a man named Gerald Lindqvist, who had held the position for 11 years. Lindqvist was known for his precise record-keeping and his exceptional memory for faces. In an era before photographic identification, station agents served as informal gatekeepers, noting suspicious travelers and maintaining logs of unusual activity. Lindqvist took this responsibility seriously. He kept detailed journals of his observations, recording not just ticket sales, but also descriptions of passengers, their demeanor, and any conversations of note. It was Lindqvist who first documented the woman who would come to be known in railroad folklore as the passenger who paid twice. On the morning of April 7, 1921, a woman approached Lindqvist's ticket window and requested passage to Cheyenne. Lindqvist recorded the transaction in his sales ledger. One ticket, coach class, Evanston to Cheyenne, purchased by a woman giving her name as Clara Vestergaard. The fare was $12.40. The woman paid in exact change. Lindqvist's journal entry for that day includes a description. Female passenger, approximately 30 years of age, fair complexion, light brown hair worn in a simple knot. Gray traveling coat, no hat. Carried a single carpet bag, brown leather, well worn. Spoke clearly but briefly, did not make eye contact, appeared nervous or distracted. The eastbound train departed Evanston at 10:15 that morning. Lindqvist personally observed Clara Vestergaard board the third passenger car. He noted this in his journal as well, a habit he had developed for any passenger who struck him as unusual. He did not see her again. The train arrived in Cheyenne at 7:42 that evening, following scheduled stops in Green River, Rock Springs, Rawlins, and Laramie. The Cheyenne station agent, a man named Theodore Oyelaran, was responsible for documenting arrivals. His records for April 7, 1921, list the names of all passengers who disembarked from the eastbound train. Clara Vestergaard's name does not appear. Oyelaran's logs were thorough. He recorded 112 passengers departing the train that evening, including their approximate ages, distinguishing features, and any luggage they carried. No woman matching Clara Vestergaard's description is listed. No woman traveling alone with a brown leather carpet bag is mentioned. As far as the official record is concerned, Clara Vestergaard boarded a train in Evanston and never got off. The discrepancy was not discovered immediately. Station records were not routinely cross-referenced between cities. It was only in June of 1921 when a Union Pacific auditor named Esther Kimura was reviewing ticket sales for the Wyoming division that the anomaly came to light. Kimura noted that a ticket had been sold in Evanston with no corresponding arrival record in Cheyenne. She flagged the transaction for investigation. The investigation was brief and inconclusive. Gerald Lindqvist confirmed that he had sold the ticket and observed the passenger board. Theodore Oyelaran confirmed that no such passenger had arrived. Conductors who had worked the April 7th eastbound train were interviewed. None recalled a woman matching Clara Vestergaard's description. The conductor's manifest, which recorded passengers by car, showed a woman in seat 14 of the third car, but the name recorded was illegible, partially obscured by a water stain. The case was closed in July of 1921 with a notation: passenger presumed to have disembarked at intermediate stop, documentation error. 6 months later, on October 12, 1921, Clara Vestergaard walked into the Evanston station and purchased a ticket to Cheyenne. Gerald Lindqvist recognized her immediately: the gray traveling coat, the brown carpet bag, the light brown hair in a simple knot. Everything was exactly as he remembered. He later testified that he felt a coldness in my chest when he saw her approach his window. But Lindqvist was a professional. He sold her the ticket, recorded the transaction, and noted her name in his journal. The fare was $12.40. She paid in exact change. This time, Lindqvist did more than observe her board the train. He personally escorted her to the third passenger car and watched her take a seat, seat 14, the same seat recorded on the April manifest. He returned to the platform and watched the train depart. He sent a telegram to Theodore Oyelaran in Cheyenne, asking him to confirm the passenger's arrival. The telegram, preserved in Union Pacific archives, reads, "Expect arrival female passenger, Vestergaard, Clara, stop gray coat, brown carpet bag, stop confirmed disembarkation, stop urgent, stop Lindqvist Evanston." Oyelaran's response arrived the following morning. Passenger Vestergaard arrived 7. 43 stop appeared confused. Stop claims no prior train. Travel stop forwarding to authorities. Stop Oyelaran. Clara Vestergaard had arrived in Cheyenne. She was alive, coherent, and in possession of her ticket stub and carpet bag. She was also, according to Oyelaran's detailed report, utterly bewildered. A Cheyenne police officer named Martin Achebe interviewed Vestergaard at the station that evening. His report, preserved in the Laramie County Sheriff's Archives, describes a woman who appeared healthy but disoriented. When asked about her journey, she stated that she had never been on a train before today. When shown her ticket stub, clearly marked with the date October 12, 1921, she confirmed it was hers. When asked about the April 7th ticket, she expressed confusion. She had no memory of purchasing a previous ticket. She had no memory of any previous trip. "I have never been to Cheyenne," she told Officer Achebe. "I have never left Evanston until today. I don't understand why you're asking me these questions." Achebe's report notes that Vestergaard's confusion appeared genuine. She did not seem evasive or deceptive. She simply had no knowledge of the events that station records clearly documented. The investigation that followed was more thorough than the first. Lindqvist provided his journals for review. Oyalaran provided his logs. The April 7th ticket stub was retrieved from the railroad's accounting department, where it had been filed after the initial audit. The October 12th ticket stub was collected from Vestergaard herself, with her consent. The two stubs were examined side by side. They were identical in format, standard Union Pacific coach tickets, printed on cream-colored cardstock with the route and fare information stamped in black ink. Both bore handwritten notations in the margin, the date of travel, and the seat assignment. The handwriting on both tickets was the same. A document examiner from the Union Pacific Security Department, a man named Frederick Oluwaseun, analyzed the stubs and confirmed. The marginal notations on both tickets were written by the same hand. The ink, pressure, and letter formation are consistent. These notations were made by the same person. The notations were in Gerald Lindqvist's handwriting. He confirmed this readily. But Lindqvist was certain that he had written on the April 7th ticket only once, on April 7th, 1921. He had no explanation for how the October 12th ticket bore identical notations in his hand. He had written them himself, he acknowledged, but he had written them 6 months apart, on 2 separate occasions, for what he believed were 2 separate journeys. Clara Vestergaard was released without charges. There was no evidence she had committed any crime, and her confusion was not sufficient grounds for detention. She gave a forwarding address in Cheyenne, a boarding house on Cary Avenue, and disappeared into the city. Investigators attempted to contact her in subsequent months. The boarding house confirmed she had stayed there for approximately 2 weeks before departing without notice. She left no forwarding address. No further record of Clara Vestergaard has been found in Wyoming, Utah, or any neighboring state. Census records show no one by that name in the region before or after 1921. It was as if she existed only for those 2 journeys, the one she never completed and the one she couldn't remember. Gerald Lindqvist continued as station agent in Evanston until his retirement in 1938. He never spoke publicly about the Vestergaard case, but his journals, donated to the Wyoming State Archives after his death in 1952, returned to the incident repeatedly. In an entry dated December of 1921, he wrote, "I have tried to understand what happened. I have turned it over in my mind until I am exhausted. A woman bought a ticket and vanished. The same woman bought the same ticket and arrived. She did not remember the first journey. But I remember. The railroad remembers. The tickets remember. Something happened on April 7th that did not happen on October 12th, or something happened on October 12th that undid what happened in April. I do not know which possibility is more troubling." The 2 ticket stubs remain in the Wyoming State Archives, stored in an acid-free folder in the Railroad Documents Collection. Researchers who have examined them note that they are remarkably well preserved, the ink still dark, the cardstock still firm. They are filed together, as they have been since 1922, when the Union Pacific closed the case and transferred all relevant materials to state custody. The folder contains one additional item, a handwritten note, unsigned and undated, tucked between the two stubs. The paper is different from the tickets, thinner, more fragile, with a faint grid pattern suggesting it was torn from an accounting ledger. The note contains a single sentence, written in handwriting that does not match Gerald Lindqvist's or any other identified hand in the case file. She was always going to arrive. She just took the long way. No one has ever determined who wrote the note or when it was added to the file. Archivists discovered it during a routine inventory in 1979. It was not mentioned in any previous documentation. It appears to have materialized sometime between 1922 and 1979 in a folder that was opened, by official count, only 4 times during that period. The Evanston station still stands, though it has been repurposed as a museum. The ticket window where Gerald Lindqvist sold Clara Vestergaard her passage to Cheyenne is preserved behind glass, the brass grating polished, the wooden counter worn smooth by decades of transactions. A small placard mentions the station's history, but makes no reference to the Vestergaard case. The trains still run through Evanston, though they no longer stop for passengers. They pass through on their way to somewhere else, carrying freight and memories, following tracks that have witnessed a century and a half of arrivals and departures. Some of those departures, it seems, take longer than others. Some passengers board a train and never arrive. Some arrive without remembering the journey, and some perhaps are still traveling, caught between the ticket purchased and the destination reached, paying the fare again and again for a journey that refuses to end. The tickets remain, the handwriting matches, and somewhere between Evanston and Cheyenne, a woman in a gray coat is still making her way east, or perhaps she arrived long ago, and it is only the records that are still catching up. Some fires refuse to start. Thermopolis, Wyoming sits in Hot Springs County, nestled in a valley where the Bighorn River cuts through the Owl Creek Mountains. The town takes its name from the thermal springs that bubble up along the riverbank, waters that emerge at temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit, heated by geological processes deep beneath the earth. The Shoshone and Arapaho peoples considered these springs sacred, a place where the earth breathed warmth into a cold world. White settlers arrived in the 1880s, drawn by the promise of health cures, and later by the coal deposits that lay buried in the surrounding hills. By 1907, Thermopolis had become a minor hub for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which operated a branch line connecting the town to the main route at Worland. The railroad served the local ranching community and, more importantly, transported coal from the mines that dotted the foothills of the Owl Creek Range. The largest of these operations was the Gabo Mine, located approximately 8 miles northeast of Thermopolis in a narrow canyon that the miners called the Throat. The Gabo Mine had been in operation since 1899, extracting bituminous coal from seams that ran deep into the mountainside. The coal was considered high quality, dense, slow-burning, and low in sulfite. It was prized by the railroad for locomotive fuel and by homeowners throughout the region for heating. The mine employed nearly 200 men at its peak, most of them immigrants from Eastern Europe who had followed the promise of steady work into the Wyoming wilderness. On the morning of February 19, 1907, a Burlington Northern locomotive designated Engine 447 departed Thermopolis at 6:15, pulling a consist of 8 freight cars bound for Worland. The engineer was a man named Oscar Lindqvist, a 20-year veteran of the Wyoming lines. His fireman was a younger man named James Oduya, who had transferred from the Nebraska Division 3 months earlier. The locomotive's tender was fully loaded with coal from the Gabo mine, approximately 12 tons, enough fuel for the round trip with reserves to spare. The train made good progress for the first 7 miles, climbing gradually through the river valley toward the pass at Owl Creek summit. At approximately 6:52, as the locomotive began the steeper grade, Oduya noticed that steam pressure was dropping. He checked the firebox and found the fire burning low. He added more coal. The fire did not respond. What followed was documented in a detailed incident report filed by Lindqvist 3 days later, a report that would become one of the most unusual documents in the Burlington Northern's Wyoming archives. Fireman Oduya reported difficulty maintaining steam pressure at approximately 6:50, Lindqvist wrote. I observed him adding coal to the firebox in normal fashion. The coal did not ignite. I ordered him to check the draft and clear the grates. He reported both in proper working order. I then stopped the train to investigate personally. Lindqvist climbed down from the cab and examined the tender. The coal appeared normal, black, dense, properly sized for locomotive use. He picked up a lump and found it cold to the touch, as if it had been sitting in snow, though the tender was warm and the morning air was above freezing. He ordered Oduya to rake out the firebox completely and start fresh. Oduya rebuilt the fire using kindling and kerosene from the emergency stores. The kindling burned, the kerosene burned, the coal, when added to the flames, did not. Oduya later described the effect as watching the fire go around the coal, like water around a stone. The flames touched it but wouldn't take. It just sat there, black and cold, while everything else burned. The train remained stalled for 4 hours. Lindqvist sent Oduya walking back toward Thermopolis to report the situation while he attempted various methods to ignite the coal. He tried different sections of the tender, thinking perhaps a portion had been contaminated. Every piece of coal behaved the same way. He tried crushing the lumps into smaller pieces. He tried mixing the coal with additional kerosene. Nothing worked. The coal would not burn, Lindqvist wrote. I have been firing and driving locomotives for 20 years. I have seen wet coal, poor coal, and contaminated coal. This was none of those things. This coal simply refused to ignite. It was as if it had never been alive, had never been part of anything that could burn. A relief locomotive arrived from Thermopolis at 11:20, carrying a fresh supply of coal from the town's reserve stockpile. This coal, sourced from a different mine near Crosby, burned normally. Engine 447 was refueled and completed its journey to Worland, arriving 6 hours behind schedule. The original coal from the Gibo mine was left in a pile beside the tracks, where it remained for several days before being collected for analysis. The Burlington Northern took the incident seriously. Coal that wouldn't burn was more than an inconvenience. It was a potential disaster. If a locomotive lost steam power on a mountain grade, it could roll backward, derail, or collide with following trains. The company needed to understand what had gone wrong. Samples of the Gibo coal were collected and sent to the Colorado School of Mines in Denver for chemical analysis. The shipment departed Thermopolis on February 23rd aboard a freight car bound for the main line at Casper, from which it would be routed south to Denver. The samples never arrived. Railroad records show that the freight car reached Casper without incident on February 24th. The car was switched to a southbound consist that same evening. When the train arrived in Denver on February 26th, the car was present, but the coal samples were gone. The containers in which they had been packed were found empty, the lids removed and set neatly aside. No sign of the coal itself was ever discovered. No one had seen anyone access the car during the journey. The loss was recorded as unexplained cargo disappearance and referred to the Railroad Security Department, which conducted a brief investigation and found no evidence of theft or tampering. The case was closed without resolution. Meanwhile, in Thermopolis, the Gibo mine was experiencing difficulties of its own. Production reports from February of 1907 show a sharp decline in output beginning around February 20th, the day after the locomotive incident. Miners reported that the coal seams they were working had become resistant, a term that appears repeatedly in contemporary accounts but is never clearly defined. Tools that had cut easily through the black rock now met unexpected resistance. Drilling equipment overheated and failed. Blasting charges, which normally shattered the coal into manageable pieces, seemed to have reduced effect. A mine foreman named Pyotr Kowalczyk wrote to the company's headquarters in Cheyenne on February 27th, "The men are frightened. They say the coal has changed. I do not believe in such things, but I cannot explain what is happening. We extracted 40 tons last week. This week, we have extracted 7. The seam is there, the coal is there, but it will not come out." The miners, many of them from Poland and Ukraine, had their own explanations. They spoke of martwy węgiel, dead coal, a term from Eastern European mining folklore describing coal that had lost its fire. According to tradition, dead coal appeared when the earth was angry or when something had been taken that should not have been taken. The only remedy was to leave the coal alone, to seal the mine, and let the earth rest. The Gabo Mining Company did not believe in folklore. But on March 10, 1907, 3 weeks after the locomotive incident, the company announced that the Gabo mine would be closed indefinitely for geological reassessment. Workers were laid off. Equipment was removed. The mine entrance was sealed with timber and earth. The official explanation cited unstable geological conditions and declining coal quality. No geological report supporting this explanation has ever been located in company archives or state records. The mine remained closed. The town of Gabo, which had grown around the mine, declined rapidly. By 1915, most residents had left. By 1920, the town was effectively abandoned. Today, only foundations remain, scattered concrete slabs and rusted machinery slowly being reclaimed by sagebrush and wild grass. The mine entrance is still visible, a dark depression in the hillside, sealed and silent. The coal that was left beside the tracks on February 19, 1907, was eventually cleared by a section crew and disposed of, dumped into a ravine approximately 2 miles from the original site. A railroad worker named Samuel Achterberg, who participated in the cleanup, later told a local historian that the coal was still cold when they moved it, despite having sat in the open for more than a week. "It should have been frozen solid or warmed up by then," Achterberg said. "It was neither. It was just cold, like it had its own temperature that had nothing to do with the air." The ravine where the coal was dumped is located on private ranch land northeast of Thermopolis. The current owners, a family named Johansson who have worked the land since 1942, report that nothing grows in that particular spot. The surrounding terrain supports healthy grass and sagebrush, but the area where the coal was dumped, roughly 30 feet in diameter, remains bare. Soil tests conducted in 1987 showed no unusual chemical composition. The soil simply refuses to support plant life. Local children have long avoided the spot, though most cannot say exactly why. A woman named Rebecca Moreau, who grew up on a neighboring ranch in the 1960s, recalled the area in a 2009 interview. "We called it the cold spot. Even in summer, it felt different there. Not cold exactly, but like the warmth couldn't reach it. Like whatever was in the ground was pulling the heat down and not giving it back." The Burlington Northern, now part of BNSF Railway, has no official position on the 1907 incident. The original incident report remains in the company's historical archives, available to researchers, but rarely consulted. Oscar Lindqvist continued working for the railroad until 1923, when he retired and moved to California. His personal papers, held by a grandson in Sacramento, contain a single additional reference to the incident, a letter to his wife, written the night of February 19, 1907, from a boarding house in Worland. "Something was wrong with that coal," Lindqvist wrote. "I have thought about it all day, and I cannot explain it. Coal burns. That is what coal is, ancient fire, waiting to be released. But this coal had no fire in it. It was as if someone had already burned it long ago, and what we put in our tender was only the memory of coal. the shape of it, the weight of it, but not the thing itself. He never mentioned the incident again. The Gabo mine remained sealed. The company that owned it dissolved in 1919, its assets absorbed by larger operations that had no interest in reopening a mine that had been deemed geologically unstable. No one has entered the mine in over a century. But the coal is still there, deep in the mountain, in seams that run for miles beneath the Owl Creek Range, black and dense and cold, waiting perhaps for someone to try again. The fire went out before it started. The coal remains in the sealed mine, in the barren ravine, in the memory of men who watched flames refuse to catch. Some things, it seems, have already given up their heat. Some fires burned long ago in darkness and left nothing behind but stone. Some places are found before they are reached. The Aspen Tunnel lies in Lincoln County, Wyoming, approximately 14 miles southwest of Kemmerer, in a stretch of the Overthrust Belt, where ancient rock formations have been folded and faulted by forces that predate human memory. The Oregon Short Line Railroad, a subsidiary of the Union Pacific, began construction of the tunnel in the spring of 1907 as part of a branch line connecting the coal fields of southwestern Wyoming to the main transcontinental route. The project was considered routine, a 1,200-foot bore through a granite ridge that would save the railroad nearly 3 miles of difficult grade. The ridge itself had no official name. Local ranchers called it the Hump, a low, rounded mass of gray stone that rose perhaps 200 feet above the surrounding terrain. It was not an imposing feature, nothing like the dramatic peaks of the nearby Salt River Range, but it was solid. Core samples taken before construction showed dense, unfractured granite extending to a depth of at least 300 feet. There were no known caves, no fissures, no geological anomalies that would complicate the work. The Oregon Short Line contracted a crew of 112 men for the tunnel project, most of them experienced hard rock miners recruited from operations in Colorado and Montana. The crew was divided into 2 shifts, working around the clock, drilling and blasting from the eastern portal. There was no western crew. The company had considered a 2-portal approach, which would have halved the construction time, but the western face of the ridge was too steep to accommodate equipment. All work would proceed from the east, foot by foot, until the tunnel emerged on the other side. The foreman was a man named Henrik Larsson, a Swedish immigrant who had supervised tunnel construction for the Northern Pacific before joining the Oregon Short Line. Larsson was known for his meticulous documentation. His daily logs, preserved in the Union Pacific Historical Collection, provide an unusually detailed account of the project's progress and of the events that would later prove impossible to explain. Work began on April 15, 1907. Progress was slow but steady. The granite was hard, requiring extensive drilling before each blast, but it fractured cleanly and produced minimal debris. By June, the crew had advanced nearly 200 feet into the ridge. By September, they had reached 400 feet. Larsson's logs from this period are routine: shift reports, powder consumption, equipment maintenance, occasional injuries. Nothing unusual. The first anomaly appears in Larsson's entry for October 3, 1907. Night shift reports hearing sounds from ahead, Larsson wrote, hammering, as if another crew were working the western face. Foreman Olerud investigated but found nothing. Men are uneasy. I have reminded them that sound travels strangely underground. The sounds continued. Over the following weeks, multiple workers reported hearing what seemed to be a second crew working from the opposite direction, the steady rhythm of hammers on rock, the murmur of voices, occasionally even the shrill note of a lunch whistle. The sounds were always distant, always muffled, always coming from somewhere ahead, deeper in the unfinished tunnel. Larsson initially attributed the phenomenon to acoustic effects. Granite, he noted, could transmit sound over considerable distances, and it was possible the men were hearing echoes of their own work, distorted and delayed by the rock. But this explanation grew harder to sustain as the weeks passed. The sounds were heard during shift changes, when no one was working. They were heard from positions that should have been acoustically isolated, and they were consistent, always hammering, always voices, always from the west. A worker named Tomasz Wojcik, a Polish miner who had worked tunnels in Pennsylvania and Colorado, offered a different theory. According to Wojcik, the sounds were Tommyknockers, spirits of dead miners who inhabited underground spaces, warning the living of danger, or sometimes leading them astray. Wojcik's explanation was dismissed by Larsen as superstition, but it spread quickly among the crew. Men began leaving small offerings at the tunnel face, tobacco, coins, scraps of food, in the hope of appeasing whatever was making the sounds. By December of 1907, the tunnel had advanced to 700 feet. The sounds had grown louder, more distinct. Workers now reported hearing not just hammering, but individual voices, conversations in a language none of them recognized. A night shift foreman named Gustav Johansson told Larsen that he had heard a child laughing somewhere in the darkness ahead. Larsen noted the report, but offered no comment. On January 14, 1908, the crew broke through into an unexpected void. The day shift had set charges at the tunnel face and retreated to the portal for the blast. The explosion was normal, a deep rumbling concussion followed by the clatter of falling rock. But when the dust cleared and the crew advanced to assess the damage, they found something that should not have been there. An opening in the tunnel wall roughly 4 feet in diameter, leading into darkness. Larsen was summoned immediately. He examined the opening and determined that the blast had breached the wall of a natural cavern, a cavity in the granite that had not appeared on any geological survey, had not been detected by core samples, and had given no indication of its existence during 700 feet of tunneling. The cavern was small, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, and 8 feet high. It was dry and cold, the air still and ancient. Larsen entered with a lantern and found the floor covered in fine dust that showed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. The walls were smooth, worn by water that had ceased flowing long before human memory. In the center of the cavern, arranged in a rough semicircle, were tools. There were 7 of them, 3 hammers, 2 chisels, a pick, and a wedge. They were made of iron, heavily corroded but still recognizable. Their design was simple, cruder than the tools used by Larsen's crew, but clearly intended for the same purpose: rock work, tunnel work. And beside the tools, half buried in the dust, was a child's shoe. Larsen collected the items and brought them to the surface. The tools were examined by the company's equipment supervisor, a man named Frederick Okonkwo, who could not identify their manufacturer. "They're old," Okonkwo noted in his report. "Very old. The iron is of a type I haven't seen used in 40 years. The forging is rough, possibly done by hand in a small operation. These are not company tools. They are not any tools I recognize." The shoe was examined by a leather merchant in Kemmerer named Elijah Sandoval, who had worked in the trade for 3 decades. Sandoval's assessment was unequivocal. The shoe was handmade, constructed using techniques common in the 1850s and 1860s, and showed wear consistent with regular use by a child of approximately 6 to 8 years of age. The leather had been preserved by the dry, cold conditions of the cavern. Sandoval estimated the shoe's age at 50 years, possibly more. The Oregon Short Line Railroad did not reach Lincoln County until 1901. The nearest settlement in 1860 was Fort Bridger, more than 30 miles to the south. There were no mining operations in the area, no construction projects, no recorded reason for anyone, let alone a child, to have been in this isolated ridge in the years before the Civil War. And yet, the tools were there. The shoe was there. Someone had been inside that cavern, working, perhaps living, nearly half a century before the railroad arrived to blast it open. Larson's logs for the following weeks reflect a crew in disarray. Work continued, but morale had collapsed. Men requested transfers, others quit outright. The sounds from ahead had stopped after the cavern was breached, stopped completely, as if whatever had been making them had finally been found. But this silence was, if anything, more disturbing than the noise had been. The tunnel felt empty now, the workers said, empty and waiting. The Aspen Tunnel was completed on March 7, 1908. The final blast broke through to daylight on the western face of the ridge, and the crew walked the full 1,200 feet without incident. The cavern had been sealed with concrete during construction, its opening covered and incorporated into the tunnel wall. Larson noted the completion in his log with a single sentence. Tunnel finished, men are glad to leave. The tools and the shoe were sent to the Union Pacific's headquarters in Omaha for further analysis. They arrived on March 22, 1908. A receipt confirms their delivery to the company's records department. They were never seen again. A 1932 inventory of the Union Pacific's artifact collection makes no mention of the items. A 1956 reorganization of the records department found no documentation of their disposition. They are not listed as destroyed, donated, or transferred. Like so much else in this story, they simply cease to exist in the official record. The Aspen Tunnel remains in service today, carrying freight trains through the same granite ridge that workers pierced more than a century ago. The tunnel has been reinforced and modernized over the years, its original timber supports replaced with concrete and steel. The sealed cavern is still there, presumably, a void in the rock walled off and forgotten, accessible to no one. Railroad workers who have walked the tunnel for maintenance report nothing unusual, no sounds, no voices, no sense of presence. The tunnel is, by all accounts, just a tunnel, dark, cold, and functional. But local historians have, over the years, attempted to explain the artifacts that were found inside the ridge. Some have proposed that early trappers or prospectors might have discovered the cavern through a natural entrance that has since collapsed. Others suggest that the tools might have been left by an unrecorded surveying expedition. The child's shoe remains harder to explain. Children did not accompany surveying parties. Children did not prospect for gold in isolated mountain ridges. Children, in the 1860s, did not disappear into holes in the earth and leave only their shoes behind. There is one additional detail, recorded not in Larson's official logs, but in a letter he wrote to his brother in Sweden, dated April of 1908. I did not tell the company everything, Larson wrote. When I entered the cavern, before the others arrived, I saw something in the dust that I did not report. There were marks on the floor, not footprints, but something else. Grooves, as if something had been dragged. They led from the center of the cavern, where the tools were arranged, to the wall on the western side. The wall was solid. There was no opening, no crack, no way through. But the marks went to the wall and stopped, as if whatever made them had gone into the stone itself. Larson never returned to tunnel work after the Aspen project. He took a position as a station agent in Pocatello, Idaho, and lived there quietly until his death in 1934. His letters and personal papers were donated to the Idaho State Historical Society by his grandchildren in 1978. The letter about the cavern was not included in the donation. It was found tucked inside a family Bible, discovered only in 2003, when the Bible was appraised for an estate sale. The appraiser, unfamiliar with railroad history, nearly discarded it as ephemera. The Aspen Tunnel carries trains through the ridge today, as it has for more than a century. The concrete walls are smooth and featureless. The darkness inside is the ordinary darkness of enclosed spaces. But somewhere behind those walls there is a sealed chamber, and in that chamber perhaps there is still dust on the floor, dust that has not been disturbed in over 100 years, marked with grooves that lead to solid stone and stop. Whatever was kept in that tunnel is still there. Whatever the workers heard, working from a direction that had no crew, has fallen silent. Some places are found before they are reached, and some things, once found, can never be explained, only sealed away, buried in rock, and left to keep their secrets in the dark. Oshkradiawam, the tunnel remains, the cavern remains. And somewhere in the darkness between east and west, there is a child's shoe and a set of tools that belong to no one, left by hands that came and went through stone in a time before the railroad, in a place that was never supposed to be found. Some weight cannot be accounted for. Hannah, Wyoming lies in Carbon County, approximately 80 miles northwest of Laramie, in a high desert valley surrounded by low, treeless hills. The town was founded in 1889 to support the coal mining operations of the Union Pacific Coal Company, which extracted fuel from the rich seams that ran beneath the valley floor. By 1903, Hannah had grown into a community of nearly 2,000 people, miners, their families, and the merchants who served them. The town had a company store, a schoolhouse, 2 churches, and rows of identical wooden houses arranged in neat grids along unpaved streets. It was a company town in every sense. The mine owned the land, the houses, the store, and in many ways the people who lived there. The Hannah mines were among the most productive in Wyoming, but they were also among the most dangerous. The coal seams lay deep underground, accessed through shafts that descended more than 500 feet into the earth. Methane gas accumulated in pockets. Coal dust hung in the air, invisible and explosive. Ventilation was primitive. Safety protocols were minimal. The miners, many of them immigrants from Finland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, accepted these conditions because they had no alternative. The mine paid wages. The mine provided housing. The mine was life. On June 30th, 1903, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, an explosion ripped through mine number 1. The blast originated in the 5th level, more than 400 feet below the surface. Investigators would later determine that a pocket of methane gas had been ignited by an open flame, likely a miner's lamp, though the exact source was never confirmed. The explosion traveled through the tunnels at tremendous speed, killing men instantly, collapsing passages, and igniting the coal dust that hung in the air. Secondary explosions followed. Within minutes, the mine had become a tomb. 169 men died. It remains the deadliest industrial accident in Wyoming history. Rescue efforts began immediately. Volunteers descended into the smoke-filled shafts, searching for survivors amid the rubble and the dead. They found precious few. Most of the men in the lower levels had been killed outright by the blast or the subsequent collapse. Those in the upper levels had suffocated, overcome by the poisonous gases that filled the tunnels. By nightfall, only 23 men had been brought out alive. The survivors were in poor condition, burned, injured, many barely conscious. The company doctor, a man named William Okafor, did what he could with limited supplies, but it was clear that the injured needed more advanced care than Hannah could provide. A decision was made to transport them to Laramie, where the Union Pacific maintained a hospital facility. A special train was assembled that evening. 1 locomotive, 1 baggage car converted to carry medical supplies, and 2 passenger coaches to transport the survivors and their attendants. The train departed Hannah at 9:15 in the evening, carrying 23 injured miners, 4 company doctors, and 11 volunteers who had assisted in the rescue. Before departure, the train was weighed on the company scale at the Hannah Depot. This was standard procedure for any consist leaving the yard, a way of calculating fuel requirements and ensuring the locomotive was not overloaded. The scale operator, a man named Carl Lindqvist, recorded the total weight, 84,600 pounds. The train arrived in Laramie at 1:47 in the morning. The survivors were unloaded and transported to the hospital. The train was moved to the Union Pacific Maintenance Yard, where it was weighed again as part of the standard arrival protocol. The scale operator in Laramie, a man named Joseph Achterberg, recorded the weight, 87,800 pounds. The train weighed 3,200 pounds more than it had when it left Hannah. The discrepancy was noticed immediately. Achterberg, assuming an error, requested a reweigh. The train was moved to a second scale at the far end of the yard. The result was the same, 87,800 pounds. A third weighing, conducted the following morning on the mainline scale at the Laramie Depot, confirmed the figure. The Union Pacific launched an investigation. Inspectors examined the train car by car, searching for any cargo that might account for the additional weight. The baggage car contained only medical supplies, bandages, splints, bottles of chloroform and laudanum, all of which had been inventoried before departure. The passenger coaches were empty, their seats stained with soot and blood, but otherwise unremarkable. The locomotive's tender held slightly less coal than it had at departure, as expected. There was nothing on the train that could explain 3,200 additional pounds. The investigation interviewed the crew and passengers. The engineer, a man named Sigurd Johansson, stated that the journey had been uneventful. The fireman, Robert Oduya, confirmed this. The doctors and volunteers were questioned individually. All gave consistent accounts. The train had departed Hannah, traveled directly to Laramie without stops, and arrived without incident. No one had boarded. Nothing had been loaded. But when investigators questioned the survivors, the 23 miners who had been rescued from the collapsed tunnels, they encountered something unexpected. The miners refused to discuss the journey. This was not simple reticence. The men were not evasive or vague. They simply would not speak about the train ride at all. When asked directly about the journey from Hannah to Laramie, they fell silent, stared at their hands, or changed the subject. Several became visibly distressed. One man, a Finnish miner named Aino Korhonen, began weeping and would not stop until the interviewer left the room. A company physician named Dr. Harold Mbeki, who treated several of the survivors in the weeks following the disaster, noted this behavior in his medical records. The patients display a marked aversion to discussing their transport from Hannah, Mbeki wrote. This is distinct from their willingness to describe the explosion itself, which several have recounted in detail. The journey specifically appears to cause significant psychological distress. I have not encountered this pattern before. One survivor eventually broke his silence, though not to company investigators. Anders Gustafsson was a 34-year-old Swedish immigrant who had worked in the Hannah mines for 6 years. He had been on the second level when the explosion occurred and had survived by sheltering in a ventilation alcove until rescuers found him. He was badly burned on his arms and face, but otherwise uninjured. He was transported to Laramie on the rescue train and released from the hospital 3 weeks later. In 1921, 18 years after the disaster, Gustafsson gave an interview to a journalist named Margaret Oyalaren, who was writing a retrospective article on the Hannah explosion for the Laramie Boomerang. The interview was never published. Oyalaran's editor deemed it too disturbing for a memorial piece, but her notes survived in the newspaper's archives, where they were discovered by a researcher in 1987. According to Oyalaran's notes, Gustafsson spoke openly about the explosion, the rescue, and his recovery. But when she asked about the train journey to Laramie, he paused for a long time before answering. "We were not alone on that train," Gustafsson said. "The coaches were full, every seat, but there were only 23 of us, and the doctors, and the volunteers. The others—" He stopped, and Oyalaran noted that his hands were trembling. "The others were the men who didn't make it out, our friends, our brothers. They were sitting with us. I could see them. We all could. No one spoke about it. No one looked at them directly. But they were there. They rode with us all the way to Laramie, and when the train stopped, they were gone." Oyalaran pressed for details. Gustafsson provided few. He said the figures had been gray, like ash, and had sat perfectly still throughout the journey. He said they made no sound. He said he recognized several of them, men he had worked beside for years, men whose bodies were still buried in the collapsed tunnels. He said he did not know if they had been ghosts or hallucinations, or something else entirely. "I have thought about it every day since," Gustafsson told Ojalainen. "I do not believe in spirits. I am a practical man. But I know what I saw. And I know that when we left Hannah, there were 38 people on that train. When we arrived in Laramie, there were 38 people on that train. The scales don't lie. The weight was there. They were there. And then they weren't." 38 passengers at an average adult weight of approximately 170 pounds would account for an additional 2,550 pounds, less than the 3,200-pound discrepancy, but within range if some of the figures were larger men or if other factors were involved. The Union Pacific closed its investigation in August of 1903. The official finding attributed the weight discrepancy to measurement error at the point of origin, suggesting that the Hannah scale had been improperly calibrated. This explanation was accepted by company management despite the fact that the Hannah scale had been inspected and certified just 2 weeks before the disaster, and despite the fact that the Laramie measurements had been confirmed on 3 separate scales. Carl Lindqvist, the Hannah scale operator who recorded the original weight, disputed the finding until his death in 1929. "My scale was accurate," he told a local historian in 1926. "I weighed that train myself. I know what it weighed. What happened between Hannah and Laramie is not my error. Something was added to that train. I don't know what. I don't want to know." The Hannah mines continued to operate after the disaster, though under stricter safety regulations. A second explosion in 1908 killed 59 more men, cementing Hannah's reputation as one of the most dangerous mining towns in the American West. The mines finally closed in 1954. The town survives today as a small community of fewer than 800 people, sustained by ranching and by travelers passing through on Interstate 80. The Hannah Cemetery contains a mass grave where many of the 1903 victims are buried. A stone monument lists their names, 169 men, many of them with families who would never see them again. The grave is well maintained, visited occasionally by descendants and historians and those who simply wish to pay their respects. But there is another marker in the cemetery, smaller and easier to miss. It stands near the back fence, partially obscured by sagebrush. The stone is blank, no name, no date, no inscription. Cemetery records indicate it was placed in 1904, but they do not indicate by whom or for what purpose. Local legend holds that the marker commemorates the ones who rode the train, the additional passengers, the weight that could not be explained, the figures that Anders Gustafsson and his fellow survivors saw sitting beside them in the darkened coaches. The legend holds that they were the spirits of the dead riding one last time from the place where they had lived and worked to the place where they could finally rest. The legend does not explain why spirits would have weight. It does not explain what 3,200 pounds of presence would look like, or feel like, or mean. It only notes that the scales were checked and the measurements were accurate, and something was on that train that was not there when it departed, something that arrived in Laramie in the early hours of July 1st, 1903, and then was gone. The records remain. The discrepancy remains. And somewhere between Hannah and Laramie, on a stretch of track that trains still travel today, the weight of 169 men made itself known, briefly, inexplicably, and never again. The train arrived heavy. The survivors would not speak, and in the Hannah Cemetery, a blank stone stands for those who were never officially aboard, passengers who rode through the night, adding their weight to the journey, and then departed into silence, leaving only numbers behind. Some calls come from places that do not exist. Rock Springs, Wyoming, sits in Sweetwater County, a railroad town that grew from the coal deposits that fueled the Union Pacific's westward expansion. By 1934, the town had evolved into a major division point, a place where crews changed, locomotives were serviced, and dispatchers coordinated the movement of trains across hundreds of miles of high desert track. The dispatch office occupied a second-floor room in the Rock Springs Depot, equipped with telegraph keys, telephone lines, and, as of 1932, a two-way radio system that allowed direct communication with locomotives in the field. The radio system was considered a modern marvel. Previous generations of dispatchers had relied on telegraph stations spaced along the line, requiring trains to stop for orders. The new system allowed real-time communication, reducing delays and improving safety. Dispatchers could warn engineers of obstacles ahead, coordinate meets between opposing trains, and respond to emergencies as they developed. The Union Pacific invested heavily in the technology, training its dispatchers in proper radio protocol and maintaining detailed logs of all transmissions. George Mills had worked as a dispatcher in Rock Springs for 11 years by the autumn of 1934. He was 46 years old, a quiet man with a reputation for precision and calm under pressure. His colleagues described him as unflappable, the sort of person who could manage a dozen trains on a busy night without raising his voice or losing track of a single consist. He had never been involved in an accident, never made an error that resulted in injury or damage. His personnel file, preserved in the Union Pacific's historical archives, contains only commendations. On the night of October 17, 1934, Mills was working the graveyard shift alone. This was standard practice. Overnight traffic was light, and a single dispatcher could handle the workload. Mills had signed on at 11 o'clock and settled into the routine of monitoring the board, logging train positions, and responding to occasional radio checks from crews in the field. At approximately 2:23 in the morning, Mills received a radio transmission. The voice on the radio was male, distressed, and partially obscured by static. According to Mills's written account, filed the following day, the caller identified himself as the engineer of an eastbound freight and reported that his train had derailed near Point of Rocks, approximately 28 miles east of Rock Springs. The caller requested immediate assistance, stating that there were injuries among the crew and that the locomotive was on its side, blocking the main line. Mills responded immediately. He acknowledged the distress call, requested the train's identification number, and began coordinating a rescue response. He contacted the section foreman in Rock Springs, arranged for a relief locomotive to be dispatched, and notified the division superintendent in Rawlins of the emergency. Within 15 minutes, a rescue train was en route to Point of Rocks, carrying medical supplies, equipment, and a crew of 12 men. The rescue train arrived at Point of Rocks at 3:47 in the morning. The crew found nothing. The main line was clear, the tracks were undamaged. There was no derailed locomotive, no freight cars, no debris of any kind. The section of track near Point of Rocks was exactly as it should have been, empty, silent, stretching east and west into the darkness. The rescue crew walked the line for 2 miles in each direction and found no evidence that any train had passed through in hours. A series of urgent communications followed. Mills was contacted by the rescue crew and informed that there was no derailment. He insisted that he had received a distress call and had responded appropriately. The division superintendent, a man named Henrik Johansson, ordered a complete review of all train movements on the Wyoming division. The review, completed by dawn, revealed a troubling fact. There had been no eastbound freight anywhere near Point of Rocks at the time of the distress call. The nearest eastbound train had been a passenger consist that passed through Point of Rocks at 11:42 the previous evening, nearly 3 hours before Mills received the transmission. No other trains had been scheduled, and none had been dispatched without documentation. The distress call had come from a train that did not exist. Mills was summoned to the superintendent's office later that morning. He was exhausted, confused, and increasingly distressed. He maintained that he had received the call, that he had heard a voice clearly identifying a derailed train, and that he had responded according to protocol. He could not explain the absence of any train at the reported location. He could not explain how he had been deceived or by whom. It was at this point that someone suggested reviewing the radio recordings. The Union Pacific had recently installed recording equipment in its dispatch offices, capturing all radio transmissions for quality control and training purposes. The recordings were made on wire recorders, an early magnetic storage technology that allowed several hours of audio to be preserved on a single spool. Mills himself had overseen the installation of the Rock Spring system and was familiar with its operation. The recording from the night of October 17th was retrieved and played back in the superintendent's office. Several witnesses were present, including Mills, Superintendent Johansson, and two other dispatchers who had been called in to assist with the investigation. The playback began with routine traffic, position reports, acknowledgments, the mundane chatter of a quiet night on the railroad. At the 2:23 mark, the distress call began. The voice on the recording was clear, despite the static. It identified an eastbound freight, reported a derailment near Point of Rocks, requested assistance. The words matched Mills's account exactly. The tone was urgent, strained, the voice of a man in genuine distress. The voice was George Mills's own. Mills recognized it immediately. The witnesses recognized it. There was no question. The distress call, the transmission that had come through Mills's radio, that he had received and responded to, had been made in his own voice. He was listening to himself report an accident that had never happened, request help for a train that did not exist. Mills denied making the transmission. He had been alone in the dispatch office, he acknowledged, but he had been receiving the call, not sending it. He had no memory of speaking those words. He had no explanation for how his voice had come through his own radio, as if from somewhere out on the line. The investigation that followed was thorough but inconclusive. Technicians examined the radio equipment and found it functioning normally. The recording equipment was tested and verified to be accurate. There was no evidence of tampering, no indication that someone had staged an elaborate hoax. The voice on the recording was subjected to analysis by a University of Wyoming linguistics professor named Dr. Eleanor Okonkwo, who concluded that it was consistent in all measurable respects with known samples of George Mills's speech. The Union Pacific considered several explanations. Atmospheric skip, a phenomenon in which radio signals bounce off the ionosphere and travel great distances, was proposed as a possible cause, but this would not explain how Mills's voice had been transmitted without his knowledge. Equipment malfunction was suggested, but no fault was found. Deliberate deception was considered, but no motive could be identified, and Mills's record was spotless. In the end, the company settled on the only explanation that did not require supernatural intervention. George Mills had suffered some form of dissociative episode, had made the transmission himself without conscious awareness, and had then received and responded to his own call. This explanation was not supported by any medical evidence. Mills was examined by two physicians, neither of whom found any indication of mental illness or neurological impairment. But it was the only explanation that fit the available facts. Mills was placed on indefinite medical leave on October 25, 1934. He never returned to work. In the years that followed, Mills lived quietly in Rock Springs, supported by a small disability pension from the railroad. He avoided discussing the incident with friends and family, though his wife, a woman named Ingrid Mills, later told a local historian that her husband was never the same after that night. He had trouble sleeping, she said. He avoided radios of any kind. He sometimes stood at the window late at night, staring west toward Point of Rocks, as if waiting for something. Mills died on March 3, 1937, of heart failure. He was 49 years old. His death certificate lists no contributing factors. His obituary in the Rock Springs Rocket mentions his years of service with the Union Pacific, but makes no reference to the incident that ended his career. The recording from October 17, 1934, was preserved in the Union Pacific's archives until 1952, when a fire at the Omaha Records facility destroyed a significant portion of the company's historical materials. The wire spool containing Mills's transmission was among the items lost. No copies are known to exist, but the incident was not entirely forgotten. Railroad workers who served in Rock Springs in the decades that followed passed down the story of the dispatcher who answered himself, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a ghost story, sometimes simply as an unsolved mystery. The details varied in the telling, but the core remained consistent. A distress call from a train that wasn't there, a voice that belonged to the man who received it, a rescue mission that found nothing but empty track and silence. In 1978, a Union Pacific dispatcher named Samuel Lindqvist was working the night shift in Rock Springs when he received a radio transmission that made him pause. The voice was faint, distorted by static, and requested assistance for a derailed eastbound freight near Point of Rocks. Lindqvist logged the call and was about to initiate a response when a veteran dispatcher named William Achterberg stopped him. "Don't answer it," Achterberg said. Lindqvist asked why. Achterberg, who had worked the Rock Springs dispatch office for 30 years, told him the story of George Mills. He told him that similar calls had been received sporadically over the decades, always on quiet nights, always from the vicinity of Point of Rocks, always requesting help for trains that did not exist. He told him that the calls were never investigated anymore. They were simply logged and ignored. "The first Mills answered it," Achterberg said, "and it cost him everything. Now we just let it go. Whatever's out there, it's been calling for a long time. It doesn't need our help, and we can't give it anyway." Lindqvist asked if the calls were still being recorded. Achterberg shook his head. "The recording equipment had been removed years ago," he said. No one wanted to hear what was on those tapes. The dispatch office in Rock Springs was closed in 1996, its functions consolidated into a centralized facility in Omaha. The building still stands, converted into a museum that documents the history of the railroad in southwestern Wyoming. Visitors can see the old dispatch board, the telegraph keys, the chair where George Mills sat on the night he received a call from himself. The radio equipment is gone. The recording machines are gone. The voices that once filled that room have fallen silent. But the track still runs through Point of Rocks, and the trains still pass in the night, and somewhere on the frequencies that no one monitors anymore, a voice may still be calling, distressed, urgent, familiar, requesting help for a disaster that never happened, waiting for a response that will never come. Or perhaps the response already came. Perhaps George Mills answered 40 years before the question was asked, speaking words he would not remember into a radio that was listening to itself. Some calls come from places that do not exist, and some answers are given before the questions are heard, echoes traveling backward through time, voices crossing in the darkness, waiting to be recognized. The recording is lost. The dispatcher is dead. But the call may still be traveling somewhere on the empty frequencies, waiting for someone to answer. And when they do, they may hear their own voice on the line, asking for help from a train that never was, on a night that never ended. Some things move when no one is watching. Encampment, Wyoming lies in Carbon County, tucked into a narrow valley where the Encampment River descends from the Sierra Madre Range. The town was founded during the copper boom of the late 1890s, when prospectors discovered rich ore deposits in the mountains to the west. A smelter was built, a railroad spur was constructed to haul ore and supplies, and for a brief period, Encampment thrived, a boom town in the classic Western mold, full of miners, merchants, and the inevitable collection of saloons and boarding houses that followed the promise of wealth. The boom ended in 1908, when the copper company failed and the smelter closed. The railroad spur remained, repurposed to serve the ranching and timber operations that replaced mining as the valley's economic foundation. By 1952, the line was operated by a small regional carrier, the Saratoga and Encampment Railway, which ran twice-weekly freight service between Encampment and the Union Pacific Junction at Walcott, 43 miles to the east. The terrain was challenging. The track climbed steadily from the North Platte River Valley into the foothills of the Sierra Madre, crossing numerous creeks and navigating grades that tested the limits of the small locomotives the railway employed. Maintenance was constant and expensive. The line was inspected weekly by a section crew based in Saratoga, and any defects were repaired immediately. There was no margin for error on a route this remote. On the morning of September 14, 1952, the section foreman, a man named Walter Lindqvist, completed his routine inspection of the track between Encampment and the junction. His report, filed that afternoon and preserved in the Wyoming State Archives, notes the condition of each mile of track, the state of bridges and culverts, and any repairs required. The section near milepost 17, approximately 6 miles east of Encampment, is described as good condition, no defects observed. 3 days later, on the morning of September 17th, a freight train derailed at milepost 17. The train consisted of 1 locomotive and 4 boxcars, carrying a mixed load of lumber, ranch supplies, and equipment bound for the Union Pacific interchange. The crew included engineer Harold Okonkwo, fireman David Johansen, and 2 brakemen named Thomas Achterberg and Michael Sandoval. All 4 were experienced railroaders who had worked the Encampment line for years. According to the crew's account, the journey proceeded normally until approximately 8:47 in the morning. The train was traveling at roughly 20 miles per hour, a standard speed for that section of track, when the locomotive suddenly lurched to the right. Okonkwo applied the emergency brake, but the locomotive had already left the rails. The 4 boxcars followed one by one in a cascade of grinding metal and splintering wood. And then something unusual happened. The cars stopped. Not violently, not with the catastrophic impact that typically accompanies a derailment. They simply stopped, settling onto the ground beside the track in a neat row, upright and intact. The locomotive lay on its side, but gently, as if it had been lowered rather than thrown. The boxcars behind it stood perfectly aligned, their wheels resting on the gravel ballast, their cargo undisturbed. Harold Okonkwo, interviewed the following day by a railway investigator named Samuel Mbeki, struggled to describe the sensation. "It wasn't like a crash," he said. "We were going over, and then we weren't. It was like something caught us. I felt it, pressure all around me like hands. And then we were stopped. The whole train just stopped, like someone had set us down." The other crew members gave similar accounts. David Johansen reported feeling held in place during the derailment, as if an invisible force was restraining him. Thomas Achterberg described the sensation as being inside a fist that wouldn't close. Michael Sandoval, the youngest of the crew, said simply, "Something didn't want us to die." None of the 4 men was injured. In a typical derailment at that speed, with that consist, serious injuries would have been expected. Deaths would not have been unlikely, but the crew walked away without a scratch. The investigation that followed focused initially on the cause of the derailment rather than its peculiar resolution. Investigators examined the locomotive, the track, and the surrounding terrain, searching for an explanation. What they found raised more questions than it answered. The track at milepost 17 had shifted. The right rail, which should have run parallel to the left rail at a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, had moved outward, laterally toward the east, by approximately 14 inches. The rail was not broken or bent. The spikes that secured it to the ties were still in place, though several had been pulled partially out of the wood. The rail had simply moved, taking the spikes with it, as if the entire assembly had slid sideways across the ties. This was, according to the investigators, physically impossible. Rails do not move on their own. They are held in place by spikes driven into wooden ties, which are themselves anchored in a bed of crushed stone ballast. The system is designed to resist lateral forces, the pressure of passing trains, the expansion and contraction of temperature changes, the settling of the underlying ground. A 14-inch lateral shift would require either a catastrophic failure of the anchoring system or the application of enormous external force. Neither had occurred. The spikes were intact. The ties were undamaged. The ballast showed no signs of disturbance beyond what the derailment itself had caused. There was no evidence of vandalism, no indication that anyone had tampered with the track. Ground surveys found no subsidence, no sinkholes, no geological instability that might have shifted the rail from below. The rail had simply moved 14 inches to the east, sometime in the 72 hours between Walter Lindqvist's inspection and the derailment. Investigators considered every possible explanation. Thermal expansion was ruled out. The temperature variation during those 3 days was insufficient to cause movement of that magnitude, and thermal expansion would have affected the rail's length, not its lateral position. Vandalism was ruled out for lack of evidence. Seismic activity was considered, but no earthquakes had been recorded in the region. The final report, issued in November of 1952, attributed the derailment to rail misalignment of unknown origin. It recommended enhanced inspection protocols and more frequent monitoring of the track near milepost 17. It offered no explanation for how the misalignment had occurred. It also made no mention of the crew's testimony regarding their experience during the derailment, the sensation of being held in place, the feeling of invisible hands, the uncanny precision with which the cars had come to rest. None of this appeared in the official record. Samuel Mbeki, the investigator, noted these accounts in his personal files, but excluded them from his formal report. Such testimony, he wrote in a private memorandum, is not amenable to engineering analysis and would only confuse the factual record. The Saratoga and Encampment Railway repaired the track and resumed service within 2 weeks. The derailed cars were returned to the rails using a crane brought in from Cheyenne. The locomotive, more seriously damaged, was towed to Saratoga for repairs that took several months to complete. But the crew never forgot what they had experienced. Harold Okonkwo continued working as an engineer until his retirement in 1968. In 1973, 5 years after leaving the railroad, he gave an interview to a local historian named Eleanor Vestergaard, who was compiling an oral history of the Encampment Valley. The interview was recorded on reel-to-reel tape and later donated to the Carbon County Museum. In the recording, Okonkwo speaks at length about his career, his memories of the copper boom's aftermath, and the challenges of operating a railroad in remote mountain terrain. Near the end of the interview, Vestergaard asks about the 1952 derailment. Okonkwo is quiet for a long moment before responding. "I've thought about that day for 20 years, he says. "I've told myself 100 stories about what happened. Equipment failure, freak accident, luck. But none of those stories are true. I know what I felt. I felt something catch that train. I felt something hold me in my seat while the world turned sideways. And when it was over, I looked out the window and saw those boxcars standing in a row, pretty as you please, like someone had lined them up with a ruler." Vestergaard asks if he believes the track moved on its own. Okonkwo hesitates. "I don't know about the track," he says. "I don't know how to explain the track, but I'll tell you this. When I walked away from that engine, I looked back at the rails. The right rail, the one that moved, it was shining. Clean and bright, like new steel. But the left rail was dull and rusty, same as always. Just that one rail, just the one that shifted. He pauses again, and when he continues, his voice is lower. It was like something had been sliding on it, back and forth for years, wearing it smooth. I don't know what. I don't want to know. But something was using that rail, and on the day we derailed, it moved it, just enough to put us off the track, and then it caught us, and then it let us go. The interview ends shortly after. Okonkwo died in 1979. The other crew members are also deceased. Johansen in 1984, Achterberg in 1991, Sandoval in 2003. None of them ever spoke publicly about the derailment beyond their initial statements to investigators. The section of track near milepost 17 was eventually abandoned when the Saratoga and Encampment Railway ceased operations in 1984. The rails were pulled up and sold for scrap. The ties rotted. The roadbed slowly disappeared beneath encroaching sagebrush and wild grass. But the right-of-way is still visible, a faint depression in the landscape that marks where the track once ran. Hikers who follow the old grade report nothing unusual, no strange sounds, no unexplained phenomena, no sense of presence. The valley is quiet now, empty of trains and the rhythms they once imposed. Yet there are those who remember the stories. Ranchers whose families have worked this land for generations speak of the track that moved, the derailment that should have killed 4 men but didn't, the boxcars that came to rest as if placed by careful hands. Some dismiss the stories as folklore, the kind of tale that accumulates around any remote place with a colorful history. Others are less certain. Walter Lindqvist, the section foreman who inspected the track 3 days before the derailment, lived until 1987. In his final years, suffering from the dementia that would eventually claim him, he reportedly spoke often of milepost 17. His daughter, in a 2012 interview with the Railway Historical Society, recalled his words. He kept saying the track didn't move by itself. He kept saying something moved it. He said he'd seen marks on the ties, grooves, like something had been dragging. He said he'd seen them for years, but never reported them because he didn't know what they meant. He said the grooves always led east, always the same direction, like something was trying to get somewhere, like something was pulling the rail toward wherever it needed to go. She paused, then added, he said he was glad the railway closed. He said whatever was out there, it didn't need a track anymore. It had learned to move on its own. The valley is empty now. The tracks are gone. The silence of the Sierra Madre foothills has returned, unbroken by the sound of locomotives or the rhythm of wheels on steel, but the earth remembers. And somewhere beneath the sagebrush, beneath the rotted ties and the rusted spikes, the ground may still be shifting, inch by inch, year by year, moving toward a destination no map has ever marked. The track moved 14 inches. The train fell gently. The crew walked away unharmed, and in the silence of the abandoned right-of-way, something may still be traveling, not on rails, not anymore, but through the earth itself, following a path only it can see. Some passengers travel to places that are not on any map. Rawlins, Wyoming sits at the edge of the Red Desert, a vast expanse of sagebrush and alkali flats that stretches for nearly 9,000 square miles across the southern part of the state. The town was founded in 1868 as a water stop on the Transcontinental Railroad, named for General John Aaron Rawlins, a Civil War officer who had paused there during a surveying expedition. By the late 1880s, Rawlins had grown into a modest but permanent settlement, a county seat, a railroad division point, and a gateway to the empty country that lay in every direction. The Union Pacific station in Rawlins was, for many travelers, the last outpost of civilization before the long crossing of the Red Desert. Trains stopped to take on water, change crews, and allow passengers to stretch their legs before the journey resumed. The station was staffed around the clock, and the station master was responsible for coordinating arrivals and departures, selling tickets, and maintaining the detailed records that the railroad required. From 1888 to 1912, the station master in Rawlins was a man named Cornelius Whitmore. Whitmore was 41 years old when he assumed the position, a former telegrapher who had worked his way up through the Union Pacific's ranks over 15 years of service. He was known for his meticulous nature, his precise handwriting, and his insistence on documenting every detail of station operations. His ledgers, leather-bound volumes in which he recorded ticket sales, train movements, cargo shipments, and any unusual occurrences, became legendary among his colleagues. "Whitmore writes down everything," a fellow station master once observed. "If a fly lands on his desk, it goes in the ledger." The ledgers were more than a professional requirement for Whitmore. They were a compulsion, a way of imposing order on the chaos of the railroad. Trains arrived late. Cargo went missing. Passengers complained. Equipment failed. The ledgers were Whitmore's defense against entropy, a written record that proved, at least to himself, that he had done his job correctly. Over the course of 24 years, Whitmore filled 17 ledgers with his careful notations. 16 of these volumes contain routine entries, dates, times, train numbers, passenger counts, revenue figures. They are the unremarkable records of an unremarkable station, useful to historians but hardly compelling. The 17th ledger is different. Whitmore began keeping supplementary notes in 1891, 3 years into his tenure. These notes, interspersed among the routine entries, document what he called unscheduled stops, instances in which trains paused at locations where no stations existed, and passengers either boarded or departed. The first such entry is dated March 7, 1891. Westbound passenger train number 43 reported unscheduled stop at approximately milepost 212. Whitmore wrote, "Conductor Lindqvist states that a woman in a gray dress boarded the train at this location. No station exists at milepost 212. No ticket was purchased. Woman gave her name as Mrs. Haroldson and her destination as Meridian. No station by this name exists on the Union Pacific or any connecting line. Woman departed the train at the next scheduled stop, Rawlins. I observed her cross the platform and exit through the west gate. She did not appear on the manifest. No ticket was recovered. I have recorded this incident for reference." Whitmore did not speculate about the nature of the incident. He simply documented it, as he documented everything else. But over the following years, similar entries accumulated. In October of 1893, a man boarded an eastbound freight at a location described as open prairie, no distinguishing features. He gave his name as Elias Achterberg and his destination as Sorrow Creek. No station by that name existed. He was not seen departing the train. In June of 1897, 3 passengers, 2 men and a child, departed a westbound train at a location Whitmore recorded as the Dry Wash, 6 miles west of Separation. They walked north into the desert and were not seen again. Their names, as given to the conductor, were Korhonen V, Korhonen E, and Korhonen, small boy. No first name recorded. In February of 1900, a woman boarded a train in the middle of a blizzard at a location where no shelter existed. She was covered in snow, but not cold to the touch, according to the conductor's report. She gave no name and no destination. She sat in the rear car for the duration of the journey to Rawlins and was not present when the car was inspected upon arrival. By 1912, when Whitmore retired due to declining health, his supplementary notes documented 23 such incidents, 23 unscheduled stops, 23 passengers who boarded or departed at impossible locations, 23 names that, as researchers would later discover, appear in no census record, city directory, or genealogical database of the period. 23 destinations that do not exist. Whitmore's ledgers remained in his possession after his retirement. He lived quietly in Rawlins until his death in 1931, a reclusive figure who rarely spoke about his years with the railroad. His estate was managed by a nephew, Frederick Whitmore, who inherited the house, its contents, and the 17 leather-bound volumes that had been his uncle's life's work. Frederick Whitmore had no interest in railroad history. The ledgers sat in a trunk in his attic for 27 years, unopened and unexamined. In 1958, needing money for medical expenses, he donated them to the Carbon County Museum in exchange for a modest tax deduction. The museum cataloged the ledgers and placed them in storage, where they remained largely forgotten until 1974, when a graduate student named Margaret Oyalaran discovered them while researching railroad operations in territorial Wyoming. Oyalaran was the first person to systematically examine Whitmore's supplementary notes, and her findings, published in a 1976 article in the Journal of Western History, brought the ledgers to wider attention. Oyalaran documented 15 of the 23 unscheduled stops, providing detailed transcriptions of Whitmore's entries and attempting to identify the locations and passengers involved. Her research confirmed that none of the locations corresponded to any known station, siding, or settlement. The passengers' names yielded no matches in any available record. The destinations they provided, Meridian, Sorrow Creek, Stillwater Junction, The Narrows, Last Bend, and others, did not appear on any map, timetable, or company document. Oyalaran's article noted one additional detail: 8 pages of the 17th ledger were missing. The pages had been cut out, cleanly and deliberately, at some point before the ledgers reached the museum. Frederick Whitmore, contacted by Oyalaran, denied any knowledge of the removal. The museum's accession records made no mention of missing pages. Whoever had removed them had done so without leaving any trace in the documentary record. The mystery of the missing pages attracted amateur historians, curiosity seekers, and, inevitably, conspiracy theorists. Some proposed that the pages contained information too sensitive to be made public, perhaps involving prominent local figures or criminal activity. Others suggested that the pages documented something genuinely inexplicable, something that could not be allowed to survive in the historical record. The truth, if it can be called that, emerged in 1989. A woman named Helen Sandoval, a retired librarian living in Cheyenne, contacted the Carbon County Museum with an unusual offer. She possessed, she said, 6 pages that appeared to have been cut from a leather-bound ledger. The pages had been in her family's possession since 1932, when her father, a young man named Roberto Sandoval, who had worked briefly as a handyman for Cornelius Whitmore, had received them as a gift from the elderly station master shortly before his death. The pages were examined by museum staff and confirmed to be genuine. The handwriting matched Whitmore's. The paper was consistent with the other pages in the ledger. The entries documented 6 additional unscheduled stops, bringing the known total to 21. But it was the final entry on the final page that attracted the most attention. The entry was dated November 3, 1911, approximately 1 year before Whitmore's retirement. It was longer than the others, filling most of the page in Whitmore's increasingly unsteady hand. "I have kept these records for 20 years," Whitmore wrote. "I have documented what I have seen and what has been reported to me. I have not speculated, I have not interpreted, I have only recorded. But I am old now, and I am tired, and I believe I will not live much longer. And so I will set down, for whoever may read this, what I have come to believe." The passengers who board at places where no stations exist are not traveling to destinations on this railroad. They are not traveling to destinations in this world. The names they give are not their names. The places they seek are not places we can find on any map. They are going somewhere else. somewhere that touches our line at certain points for reasons I do not understand. I do not know if they are dead. I do not know if they were ever alive. I only know that they board our trains, and they depart our trains, and they are never seen again. And I know that the conductors who see them, and the station masters who record them, do not speak of them afterward. We write them in our ledgers, and we close the books, and we do not ask questions. I have recorded 23. I believe there have been more. I believe there will be more after I am gone. The line passes through empty country. The trains stop where they are not supposed to stop, and passengers board who are not supposed to exist. I do not know what they are. I only know that I have written them down, and now my hand is too weak to write any more. The entry ends there. The remaining 2 missing pages have never been recovered. Helen Sandoval could not explain why her father had been given the pages, or why he had kept them for nearly 60 years without showing them to anyone. Roberto Sandoval had died in 1971, taking whatever he knew to his grave. His daughter donated the pages to the museum, where they were reunited with the ledger from which they had been cut. The museum has since restricted access to the 17th ledger, citing its fragile condition. Researchers who have examined it describe the supplementary entries as disturbing and difficult to explain. The names, the destinations, the descriptions of passengers who appeared from nowhere and vanished into the desert, all of it resists rational interpretation. The Union Pacific has no official record of unscheduled stops on the Rawlins section during Whitmore's tenure. Company policy required that all stops be documented, but the documentation was maintained at the division level, not the station level. If conductors reported stops at non-existent locations, those reports have not survived. The only record is Whitmore's ledger, the careful notations of a man who wrote down everything he saw, whether or not it made sense. The red desert still stretches south of Rawlins, empty and silent. The railroad still crosses it, carrying freight where passenger trains once ran. The stations that Whitmore knew, Separation, Creston, Wamsutter, still appear on maps, though most are automated now, unstaffed and quiet. But somewhere out there, at locations that have no names and no coordinates, the trains may still be stopping. Passengers may still be boarding, giving names that do not exist, traveling to destinations that cannot be found. And somewhere, perhaps, a ledger is still being kept, a record of the lost stops, the impossible journeys, the travelers who pass through our world on their way to somewhere else. Cornelius Whitmore documented 23. The true number may be much higher. Some passengers travel to places that are not on any map, and some station masters, watching from the platform, write down what they see and close the book, knowing that the mystery will outlive them all. The ledger remains. 14 pages are still missing, and in the empty country south of Rawlins, where the sagebrush meets the sky, the trains still pass through, pausing perhaps at stops that no schedule has ever listed, for passengers who have been traveling longer than anyone can remember. Some signals are meant for trains that have already passed. Opal, Wyoming is not a town in any meaningful sense. It is a name on a map, a cluster of buildings at the intersection of 2 rural roads, a place where perhaps 40 people live in scattered houses and trailers surrounded by the vast emptiness of Lincoln County. The nearest city of any size is Kemmerer, 15 miles to the north. The nearest interstate is more than 30 miles away. Opal exists in the silence between places, a dot on the landscape that most travelers never notice and fewer still remember. The Union Pacific maintains a spur line that passes through Opal, a remnant of the branch routes that once served the coal mines and oil fields of southwestern Wyoming. The line sees limited traffic now, 2 or 3 freight trains per week, carrying cargo between the main transcontinental route and industrial facilities to the south. The trains passed through Opal without stopping, their engineers barely glancing at the handful of buildings that mark the town's existence. There is no station, no platform, no reason to pause. But the engineers remember Opal. They remember it because of what happens 1 mile east of town, on a straight section of track that runs through open rangeland, where the only landmarks are fence posts and the distant silhouette of the Salt River Range. The first documented report dates from October of 1979. An engineer named Harold Johansson was operating a westbound freight on the night of October 14th, traveling at approximately 40 miles per hour through Lincoln County. The night was clear and cold with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Visibility was good. Johansson had worked this route for 12 years and knew every curve, every grade, every mile marker between Green River and the Utah border. At approximately 11:23, as the train approached the 1 mile marker east of Opal, Johansson saw a light on the tracks ahead. It was a lantern, or appeared to be one, swinging in a slow, deliberate arc. The movement was unmistakable, the universal railway signal to stop, used for more than a century to warn approaching trains of danger ahead. The light was amber, the color of kerosene flame, and it swung back and forth with the steady rhythm of a human arm. Johansson applied the brakes. The train slowed, then stopped, approximately 200 yards from the position where he had seen the light. He radioed the dispatcher in Green River, reporting the signal and requesting information about any track obstructions or maintenance crews in the area. The dispatcher confirmed that no crews were working the Opal section and no obstructions had been reported. Johansson climbed down from the locomotive and walked toward the location where he had seen the lantern. His fireman, a younger man named David Okonkwo, accompanied him with a flashlight. They searched the track and the surrounding area for 15 minutes. They found nothing. No lantern, no person, no evidence that anyone had been there. The rails were clear. The gravel ballast was undisturbed. The night was silent, except for the wind. The two men returned to the locomotive. It was then that Okonkwo noticed something on the window of the cab. Someone had written in the frost that had formed on the glass. The writing was clear, the letters traced by a fingertip or perhaps a gloved hand. March 7, 1918. Johansson and Okonkwo stared at the date. Neither had any idea what it meant. Neither had touched the window. The cab had been locked during their absence, a standard security measure, and there was no indication that anyone had entered. Johansson reported the incident to his supervisor the following morning. His account was documented in the company's incident log, categorized as unexplained signal, track clear upon investigation. The date written on the window was noted, but not investigated further. The train completed its journey without additional incident. Over the following decades, the pattern repeated. A 1983 report describes an engineer named Catherine Lindqvist, who stopped for a swinging lantern east of Opal and returned to find November 22, 1989 written on her cab window. A 1989 incident involved an engineer named Samuel Achterberg, who found February 14, 1891, traced in the condensation. A 1994 report filed by engineer Margaret Korhonen documented the date August 3, 1927. In each case, the circumstances were identical: a lantern swinging on the tracks, an engineer who stopped to investigate, an empty stretch of rail with no sign of any human presence, and a date written on the window, waiting for them when they returned. The Union Pacific has never publicly acknowledged the phenomenon. The incident reports exist in the company's internal records, but they are not discussed in official communications or training materials. Engineers who work the Opal section learn about the lantern through informal channels, whispered conversations in crew rooms, warnings passed from veteran to newcomer, stories shared over coffee during layovers. The dates have been cataloged by amateur researchers and railway historians. As of the most recent documented incident in 2019, engineers have reported finding 31 different dates written on their windows. The earliest is February 14, 1891. The latest is December 3, 1943. No date after 1943 has ever appeared. Researchers have attempted to correlate the dates with known railway accidents. The task is complicated by incomplete historical records, the sheer number of incidents that occurred on Wyoming railways over a 50-year period, and the possibility that the dates refer to events that were never officially documented. Some matches have been proposed. February 14, 1891 corresponds to a documented derailment near Cokeville that killed 2 crew members. November 22, 1903 falls within a week of a boiler explosion on the Oregon Short Line that claimed 3 lives. August 3, 1927 aligns with a collision in the Hannah Yards that resulted in 1 fatality, but other dates resist identification. March 7, 1918, the first date found by Harold Johansson, corresponds to no known accident in Union Pacific records. December 3, 1943, the most recent date ever recorded, yields no matches in any railway historical database. Some researchers have suggested that the dates may refer to events that were never officially reported, deaths of transients, accidents that occurred in remote locations, incidents that the railway chose to suppress. Others propose that the dates may be warnings rather than memorials, predictions of disasters yet to come, written by some presence that exists outside of normal time. Neither explanation has been proven. Neither has been disproved. The phenomenon has attracted local legend and regional curiosity. Residents of Opal and the surrounding ranches have their own stories about the lantern. A woman named Elena Gustafson, whose family has ranched in Lincoln County since 1907, told a local historian in 2008 that her grandfather had seen the lantern in 1931, long before the railway began formally documenting the incidents. He was out checking cattle at night, Gustafson said. He saw a light swinging near the tracks, about a mile east of town. He rode toward it thinking someone was in trouble, but when he got there, nothing, just empty track. He told my grandmother about it that night. She made him promise never to investigate if he saw it again. She said the light wasn't for him, it was for the trains. It was trying to stop the trains. Gustafson paused before adding, "My grandfather asked her why. Why would someone want to stop the trains? My grandmother said she didn't know. Maybe to warn them, maybe to save them, maybe just to make them pause for a moment in that one place so they would remember." The identity of whoever or whatever swings the lantern has never been established. The dates written on the windows suggest a presence connected to the railway's past, but the nature of that connection remains unclear. Railway workers have proposed various theories: a ghost of a flagman killed in the line of duty, a protective spirit watching over the trains, a remnant of some tragedy that imprinted itself on the landscape. One theory, advanced by a retired Union Pacific supervisor named William Oduya, suggests a more specific origin. In a 2012 interview with a Railway Historical Society, Oduya noted that the dates all fall within a particular era of railway history, the period before automatic signaling and modern safety systems, when human flagmen were essential to preventing accidents. "Before the signals, we had men with lanterns," Oduya said. They would walk ahead of stopped trains, or stand at crossings, or position themselves wherever danger existed. Their job was to swing the lantern, to warn approaching trains, to prevent collisions. It was dangerous work. Many of them died doing it, struck by trains they were trying to protect or caught in accidents they were trying to prevent. Oduya suggested that the lantern at Opal might be the lingering presence of such a flagman, a worker who died on that stretch of track and continues in some form to perform the duty that defined his life. The dates, in this interpretation, would be anniversaries of deaths, a roll call of the fallen that the flagman has accumulated over decades of watching the trains pass. "He's still working," Oduya said. still swinging his lantern, still trying to stop the trains. And every time one stops, he writes down a date, a name, maybe, that he remembers. Someone else who died on the rails, someone he's trying to honor. The theory is unprovable, like all theories about the lantern at Opal. But it has a certain resonance among railway workers, many of whom feel a kinship with the generations of men and women who worked the rails before them. The most recent documented incident occurred on September 8, 2019. An engineer named Thomas Sandoval, operating a westbound freight, stopped for the lantern at approximately 2:15 in the morning. He investigated and found nothing. When he returned to his locomotive, he found a date written on the window, April 19, 1911. Sandoval reported the incident through normal channels. He did not attempt to identify the date's significance. He did not speculate about the lantern's nature or origin. He simply noted what he had seen, filed his report, and continued his journey. When asked about the experience in a subsequent interview, Sandoval was reflective. "I've heard the stories," he said. "Everyone who works this line has heard them. But hearing about it and seeing it are different things. That lantern was real. I saw it swinging, clear as anything I've ever seen. And that date on my window, someone wrote it. Something wrote it. I don't know who, I don't know why. But I know it happened." He paused, looking out at the tracks that stretched toward the horizon. "I think about those dates sometimes, all those years, all those days. Someone remembers them. Someone is keeping track. And every time a train stops at Opal, they add another one, like they're building a list, a record, a memorial." Sandoval was quiet for a moment. "I wonder whose date will be next. I wonder if it's already written somewhere, waiting. I wonder if the lantern knows things we don't." The spur line through Opal remains operational. Trains pass through several times each week, carrying freight between distant points, their engineers watching the tracks ahead for signals, obstructions, and dangers. Most journeys are uneventful. The lantern does not appear for every train, or even most trains. It appears when it chooses to appear, for reasons no one has ever understood. But the engineers know. They know that 1 mile east of Opal, on any given night, a light might begin to swing. They know that if they stop, as they must, as their training requires, they will find nothing but empty track and silent darkness. And they know that when they return to their locomotive, there may be a message waiting for them, written in the frost, by a hand that was never there, a date, a memory, a name that someone somewhere refuses to forget. The lantern still swings. The dates keep appearing. And somewhere in the darkness east of Opal, a presence continues its vigil, stopping the trains, writing its messages, keeping a record of losses that no official ledger will ever contain. The living pass through without understanding, but the lantern remembers. The lantern has always remembered.